い全国大会目指して頑張ってみたいかあの若い頃の気持ちを取り戻せたら良いのにもしよろしければ行きましょうか願いが叶う街にその時間楽しい年に行くもしかして知ってるのやのととすがり出会う嫌なものって答えそうかもしれない知りて素晴らしいものそれは救いの神道だ我々の忘れおいでこれは愛の告白願って忘れましょう成長の苦悩世界を恋になり風の合う顔を叫んで気合い入れよう恋の願うの今日の京都ベケーション京都
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station's Kyoto Vacation, an anime podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I'm Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here to kick back, relax, and talk about some anime. This week on the show, we are continuing part one of our Kyoto Vacation, Crying is the Key to Happiness, Key Visual Novels in Adaptation. And we have hit a big landmark for me for this podcast season, where we are now at the first show that I have already seen. I originally watched this show about 10 years ago, and I loved it then, and I love it even more now. We are talking about Season 1 of Clannad. We will do Clannad After Story, or Season 2, however you want to refer to it, next week. But this week is all Season 1 of Clannad, all 22 episodes, and then the two bonus episodes, one bonus episode, and then an OVA. And we'll be covering all of that today. This is a show I loved when I originally saw it about 10 years ago, and is a show that also, more for stuff that happens in After Story, was so emotionally impactful for me that I haven't revisited it, so it's something I was really anticipating for this podcast, and rewatching Season 1 of Clannad for this podcast has made me appreciate it even more. I think this is like an all-time great season of anime, but Jonathan, this is the first time you have ever seen Clannad. What's your thoughts?
I didn't care for this one either, Sean. No. You already know because I couldn't stop texting you about this fucking show. This is one of the best shows I've ever seen. I honestly, and to be clear, I have not seen Season 2 yet, the second half of the series. Although, if you cut this show off at episode 22, it's perfect. I know there's much, much more story to tell, but like this first season tells a full, beautiful story on its own terms just to start with. And just from what I have seen so far, I gotta say, since we watched Mobile Suit Gundam 4 years ago, I've kind of held every anime up I've seen and gone, is this better than Mobile Suit Gundam? And generally I've gone no, with a couple of like, Turn A Gundam. It's up there. It's really close to Mobile Suit Gundam. Clannad, honestly, is one of those that I've like held up and gone, maybe this is one of the best anime I've ever seen. I think this is a perfect show. I think it is a top to bottom masterpiece. You know, I have the Blu-ray set that there have been a couple of them. This is the one that actually came out this year from Sentai Filmworks, and it says on the front, the Kyoto Animation masterpiece, Clannad. And usually I would consider that a little ostentatious to put on your Blu-ray release of a 10-year-old show, calling it a masterpiece. I think they earned this one. That is not just marketing speak. This is a genuine masterpiece. I am in awe of this thing.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I was so impressed about revisiting and just looking at this season, since I've already seen the whole show when I originally watched it, I know what happens in After Story and where the story goes and stuff. I was shocked at how well this stood completely on its own. Obviously, I know that there is a lot more story to tell, and that After Story has like a lot of amazing stuff that sort of deepens and complicates a lot of the stories and themes and ideas here. But if you never had After Story, this would still be just one of the best seasons of anime ever. Because it does tell a complete story. It does, it starts with Tomiya meeting Nagisa at the bottom of the hill, and him deciding to help her build the drama club, and it ends with her putting on the performance, right? And then them confessing in the club room that they both sort of like built together. Like, what a perfect sort of open and shut season of a show that has more room to grow with further stuff, but is in and of itself like just a perfectly told story. And I think the other thing I really appreciated about watching it is seeing it in context with the two shows that precede this one.
Yes.
Both for the Key side of it, for like, you know, obviously it's a little bit out of order in that sense, but Kanon to Air to Clannad, you can see the kind of maturation of that side of the storytelling. Then I think also for KyoAni, I think their approach on how they adapt this show, which I think also obviously like has some things to do with like hooks that the game has, but the process that Ishihara and his team made in kind of figuring out how to bring all the different threads from the source material together into one seamless season of anime. I mean, if you didn't know it was from a visual novel, if you told me this was an anime original project and I didn't know any of the background of it, I would believe you, because there's nothing about it that has that herky-jerky start and stop pace and motion that I'm so accustomed to in visual novel adaptations, that you get a little bit of an Air. Air avoids it somewhat because Air is so short and like fast paced because it's only 12 episodes, but you really get a lot in Kanon, and you get in like any other visual novel adaptation that I've seen. This avoids that completely. So yeah, like Clannad, I loved the show when I originally watched it, but as with a lot of shows that are kind of hailed as masterpieces or classics, you know, you have some people that will visit them and they'll come away with a, like, I don't see what the big deal is. Like, is the show really that good? And, you know, whatever, people's opinions on things are totally subjective. But for me, having, like, not seen it in the years and seeing some people come away with, like, a kind of, I don't see why Clannad's so good reaction, me revisiting, I'm like, yeah, no, Clannad is that good. Like, Clannad is just one of the best anime, and certainly like of this genre, it is like the exemplar. And we're not even talking about After Story. And in my memory, After Story was the best part of the show. So you know, it's kind of crazy.
No, I completely agree. I think I'll just say it. People who don't like this are definitely wrong and should feel bad about themselves. And yeah, I definitely, my journey with this show was like very informed with having watched Kanon and had very mixed feelings on it. And I think Clannad, just like in every way, and I think some of this I'm sure is from the maturation of Key on the visual novel side, but I think a lot of it is adaptationally. It is such a more confident show. It has such a clearer sense of, I think, the characters and how they interrelate and how they want to tell the story. There's none of that, as you say, herky-jerky kind of motion between arcs and stories and whatnot. It is so smooth. It honestly like made me think less of Kanon. Like it made me watch it and go, yeah, you know what? Maybe I just flat out like I think that show is kind of a failed experiment, and it was necessary to get to this point because this is pretty much perfect. And that was my reaction, start to finish. I think this show is just remarkably good, and I think it's a real leap for Kyoto Animation also on the production side. As good as Air and Kanon were, this is like about as well produced a season of anime as I have seen. Obviously, it's not doing something crazy with big fights and shit like in your UFO table adaptations, but I think on the level of like direction and character animation and your basic storyboarding and everything, this is about as good as anything I've ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, with this season, I started this habit of taking screenshots for my notes on like episodes that stand out to me. And it was like, I think I did screenshots for like 3 episodes of Air. I think I did about like 6 or 7 episodes of Kanon. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. 14 of the episodes I took screenshots for. And I could have done more. At a certain point in the home stretch, I was just like, I'm just going to not do it until episode 22. After episode 18, I'm like, I have to stop because there's only so much I can do going back through and picking out moments. Because, yeah, this is something where, like, I said this for Kanon, but I think it's like 120% more true for Clannad, where in Kanon you felt like a bigger consistency episode to episode compared to Air, which I think is true compared to Air. But, like, Clannad, it is so smooth. Like, you know, not to say that, you know, there are some episodes I think are better overall than others and are better directed overall than others. It's not that you can't see the personal touch or that, like, directors aren't putting their marks on the episodes, but every, director and every person working on the show is working at, like, such an exceptional level that there isn't any sort of meaningful gap in quality. It's more just like, okay, here's like a Kigami episode, and he's got like a certain smoothness to his storyboards and stuff that you get. Or here's like, an Ishihara episode, and he's got his style, and he adds a certain taste to it. But it's not like this is just better than the other episodes. It's just got a slightly different vibe. And that's just like remarkable, not just for like between Air and Kanon and Clannad. I mean, for any anime, the level of consistency for like the artistic and creative vision and the level of execution on display here, episode to episode, is just incredible. And it is one that I am very glad I decided to get the Blu-ray, because I was on the fence with it for Clannad, because it's it's not pricey for what it is, because you're getting a lot of anime, but it's still, any purchase that I make that is more than like $50 is something I always I think about, do I really need to buy this thing? But Clannad, owning that in high quality, that is a very worthwhile purchase, because my God, every single episode of this show is a fucking banger.
It's a great Blu-ray set. I got it for exactly $50, so I felt like that's perfect. If you're down to $1 an episode, you're in good territory. Yes, it is the Sentai set that we have. It has one problem, and it is the weirdest glitch I have ever seen on a Blu-ray. It's not a huge problem. I don't know if you noticed this, Sean. If you rewind in the episodes and you rewind to a spot where the subtitles would be playing, the subtitles don't play, and they refuse to start playing. You have to rewind to a spot where there are no subtitles, or else they will not play. And in some episodes with a lot of dialogue, that would be hard. And I have never seen that issue before. I don't know where that comes from. It made me laugh every time, because again, it's one I can understand how you would miss it in quality control, because it's a bizarre problem that you might not encounter. Other than that, great Blu-ray set.
Yes, it's that and I find the choice of art on the Blu-ray discs very funny, because they're always slightly off. That Fuko is on disc 2, even though disc 1 had the entire Fuko arc. That is not an actual problem. It's just
I think fuck them. I think they deserve to feel bad for that, Sean. They messed up.
No, it's a great set, and it is an incredible show, and I'm just very excited to get into it. I honestly was just so blown away when I was watching this and thinking man, this show is... I remember this show being an all-time classic, but I mean, partially because I hadn't revisited it in 10 years. And in that 10 years, I've watched so much anime, right? This is part of the context for me for this show. This is either the first or definitely one of the first KyoAni shows I ever would have watched. I don't remember specifically, partially because at the time I wouldn't have known what a KyoAni was. And this would have been... a little bit before I started studying Japanese, so that we were in the condo. I think it was probably the first year we were in the condo, and we were in college. And I watched Clannad and was just completely blown away by this show. And this is one of the shows where I started, when watching anime, I started kind of noticing the language a little bit and kind of picking up pieces of vocab, which helped me when I started actually taking the Japanese classes. It helped me kind of get a leg up on those, because I knew some of the basic vocab already. And so there's a lot of words like kazoku in particular that I learned from this, because it's in the ending theme about 1 million times. But that's one of my huge memories of Clannad, is it being this show, just being oh my God, look how good this show is, and how cool it is, and different and interesting. And of course now I could watch this show without the subtitles. So it's my sort of relationship to anime and Japanese media has changed so much in the intervening years. And I think there's some stuff about the production and the comedy in particular that lands a lot harder for me with there's more cultural references that I can get and stuff like that. So I think that's part of the reason why in the intervening 10 years, my appreciation for the show has just deepened so much. And so I have I was just so thrilled when I started watching this. I was also just completely emotionally bowled over by the first episode, but that's more of a connections to After Story stuff that we'll talk about there. But yeah, this show's incredible. So let's get into the history of this, because I did find some good resources for this show, because there are 2 visual books, or fan visual books is what they basically call. These are official products released in Japan that usually have interviews with the staff. They include lots of background and behind the scenes details. And I found scans of both the Clannad one for the game and the one for the show. Unfortunately, I can't find the one for After Story, so no one seems to have scanned that online, and it's very out of print. I'd have to import it from Japan, which would take fucking forever, so that's not going to happen. But I was very happy to be able to find some of this information. So if people are curious, those things are pretty easy to find. If you want to just Google around and like Clannad visual fan book, you can find it. The scans I found for the one for the game are on an incredibly NSFW website. So, just, user beware if you're finding that one. The KyoAni one for the show is fine, but the one for Clannad is on a site that has a lot of other visual novels that have a lot of erotic content in them. So viewer beware for that. But yeah, let's get into the background stuff. So Clannad the game, let's start there. So production on the game for Clannad started immediately after the release of Air in 2000. So to recap for everybody, they made Kanon in 1999, which was Key's first game. The next year they made Air. And that Air was the first one where Maeda Jun was then the creative director, because the guy who was the director for Kanon had left the company. And there are a lot of interesting tidbits I found about the production of Clannad from that visual fan book, where there are interviews with all the different writers who worked on the game. So Maeda Jun felt that he had made the kind of game that he wanted when he made Air, but some of the feedback he had from users was that some sections of the fan base had a hard time connecting to the game, partially because it was so radically different in structure, and particularly it didn't have much of that kind of the romance school stuff and selecting the different heroines. That part of the game was so de-emphasized. And so when were working on the next project, he wanted that project to be more accessible and a little bit more familiar in that way. I'm going to have a bigger emphasis on entertainment, while also still obviously having some of the things that they found with Air in terms of boiling it down ultimately to one larger story, and that obviously being Nagisa's route that then gets expanded on the After Story section of the game. But they wanted to bring it a little bit more back to that traditional Kanon style. Early in development, it was decided that the story would be less sweeping than Air, so you're not getting any of the, let's time travel back to 800 years in the past and that kind of shit. And it instead focuses specifically on exploring the bonds between people and the bonds shared between people and the town or the place in which they live, which that second theme is even more bigger in the After Story section, although you get some of it set up here, the first half of the game. Over the course of development, the scale of the game steadily grew. Writer Suzumoto Yuichi estimated that the game ended up being more than twice as long as originally planned. So it expanded in size quite substantially. As some routes became deeper and more involved, the writers for the other routes would see that, and they basically go back to theirs and be like, ah, shit. Now I got to make mine better because this one got really good. And the way they talked about it in the interview is just there's this kind of back and forth process of every time one element of the game got better, they are inspired to go back to the other sections of the game and expand on those even more, which is what blew the scale of the game out really huge. There's also substantial debate within the company as to the amount of focus that Nagisa was receiving as the main heroine because of that After Story section, and some people thought it might make the game too similar to Air, which ultimately was just about Misuzu. But once they kind of started down that path with Nagisa, I think it seemed inevitable that would have to be the thing that kind of consumed the overall story of the game. That obviously also helps when we talk about the anime, giving an anime a very clear focus. Maeda Jun felt that a flaw with Air was how much the Summer and Air routes dominated the Dream route being the one with the 3 different heroines. And so he was initially worried about the After Story section of Clannad doing that same thing, but that process of all the different writers working on all the routes in the school section of the game, making theirs stronger and more rich, he felt that, as he talked about in the interview, that they ultimately found that right balance by making that school section of the game really big and rich and rewarding in its own right. And they then, another interesting tidbit that I really liked that one of the writers mentioned, they intentionally designed Nagisa's family to be the perfect family, because every family they featured in all of their previous games, whether you're talking about Key or Tactics, the previous company, all of them were always, usually it was they were missing someone, so it was usually either the dad was dead or the mom was dead, or there was something fundamentally wrong with the family, and then Nagisa's family was supposed to be this is a good, normal, healthy family, and I think that's a very funny detail that they pointed out, but that's a really important one for the story.
They're definitely in contention for the title of best anime family ever.
Yes.
Up there with, I don't know, Son Gohan's family, they're up there for me. There's a lot of good anime families, but man, Nagisa's family rocks.
Yes, and it when they mention that, it's we realize that every family we've ever had always has something fucked up. I'm yeah, you're right. It is it's one of the things that's I think sets Clannad apart, is it doesn't fully go into those cliches. So then another note I've had from these interviews, in deepening the story and pursuing the goal of making a more entertaining game, Clannad became much more complex and structured than previous Key games. Clannad features 5 main heroines, but it also has a really large number of sub-routes. So these are a lot of the side characters you see in the anime, like the dorm mother Misae. She has her own little sub-route. Miyazawa Yukine, who's the character in the secondary library, she has her own little route. In order to unlock the after story section of the game, the player has to complete all of the main routes and all of the side routes. After completing a route in the game, the player unlocks a mote of light that represents that character's happiness. And this is something you see in that the illusionary world in the anime is represented as well there. That's what those like balls of light they see are. And collecting all the motes of light unlocks the after story option, which continues the story after Nagisa's route ends. And then in the after story section, there are even more sub-routes, and you have to complete all of those and get all the motes of light in the after story section as well to get the ultimate true ending of the game, which is what the anime is ultimately going to adapt. In all, there are 5 main routes in the school part and 5 sub-routes in the school part, and then there are 6 sub-routes in the after story part, making for a total of I guess if you count After Story as one route, 17 routes overall in the game, with After Story being gigantic. So that's what I mean by, like, the scope of the game is fucking huge. And that visual fan book I found has, like, a whole strategy guide section in it. And it made me really want to play the game because it is clearly much more complex as a game and as a visual novel than any of the other Key games before this, because there are lots of weird branching options and stuff like that. And lots of little like hidden details and things you can find in the game that are really cool.
And I want to mention, this is the only one that is out in English officially. You can play it. It's on Nintendo Switch. I don't know if it's on any other platforms here, but I know at least it's there, along with several of, it's got spin-offs and stuff, and those are on Switch as well. It's, I think, $45 list price, so it is out fully officially. At some point, I will pick that up, because I'm super fascinated to give it a try. And it's so rare we get these kind of iconic visual novels here, and we don't have Kanon or Air, but we have Clannad, and that's super cool.
Yes, because actually I do, so in my notes here, so with the English version, I'll just jump down there really quick, since you're mentioning it. So that version came out in 2014. That's by the visual novel localization company Sekai Project. It's an interesting deal. So they launched a Kickstarter in 2014 to do an English version of Clannad, right? Because it's a pretty huge translation project. The Kickstarter reached its initial goal of $140,000 in less than a day, and by the campaign's conclusion, it had raised $541,161, so a little bit more than $500,000 for that Kickstarter. They released the game on Steam on November 23rd, 2015, which is my 23rd birthday. This is the weird coincidence that I've noticed. And so that English version is available on Steam. It has also been ported to the PS4, and it is on the Switch, and then the PS4 version you can also play on PS5. And there is a, like, fan port of the Vita version that has that English translation in it as well. So if you have a jailbroken Vita, you can get the English version there as well. So yes, so the English version, pretty widely available, and yes, it is pretty rare that you get those. So if people want to play the game, it is very accessible over here, which is cool. Some other notes here. One of the things I also noticed, this will just come up in the show as well, but if in the show they have that whole thing of where the Fuko Master skill pops up, and then Fuko has a bunch of like very ridiculous scenes after that point in the show, where she shows up in other people's story routes. That's an adaptation of something from the game. There's like a lot of weird hidden things in the game like that, where I think for that the strategy guide said you had to like do all the different optional pranks on Fuko, and then you get the Fuko Master skill. Then you have to get the true ending of the game. If you get the true ending of the game and you have the Fuko Master skill, if you start playing the Tomoyo route, then Fuko will pop up in key scenes, and the anime adapts all of those, which is a fun little detail.
It's the only thing in the anime that feels like, okay, this is clearly pulled from a video game, but it is like so funny and playful. Like, you love to have it there. Like, I'm very glad they adapted it. Also because apparently it sounds like that's a very hard thing to actually get to in the game. So it's nice that they're just right there in the anime for you. Yeah,
it seemed very obscure when I was looking at that strategy guide. I mean, it had like a whole page just dedicated to it, basically, in that visual fan book. Then another thing here, I just find this whole thing very funny. So the title of the game, Clannad, it is meant to express the theme of family. And there was a lot of like stuff I found when I was looking this up of people, both in the English sphere and the Japanese sphere, debating exactly what Clannad is meant to mean. But I did find in that interview in the Visual Fan Book, Maeda Jun just straight up says, oh, Clannad means family. The reason why people debate this is because Clannad doesn't mean family. That's not what that word means. It's an Irish term, I guess, broadly speaking. The name comes from an Irish folk band called Clannad, which anyone who's looked up Clannad on Wikipedia will know, because that's the one that it goes to by default. If you just type Clannad and hit enter, which I have over the years done dozens of times when I'm thinking about, oh, what was that thing in Clannad? I'm like, no, I don't mean the Irish folk band. That band took that name from the word clan, right, which is a Gaelic word which means family, and then I think it's like the place that they're from is the like AD is a like acronym basically, and they just added that onto the end. So it means like family from this place, basically, but in this kind of abbreviated form. And so what I'm guessing is probably Maeda Jun, who's a big music fan, probably likes the band Clannad, thought that their name just meant family, didn't realize that there was a whole other aspect that's the AD part of Clannad, and he just took that name. But whatever, it's a good name. And it's a much better name than the other name they had, which is in that interview I found, one of the writers said that in an early phase of development, they were going to call the game Alive, just the English word alive, to express the theme of living. And that would have been a terrible fucking name for this. I'm very glad that they did not call this Alive, which sounds like a horror game and not like a very heartwarming visual novel about school kids falling in love.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, Clannad, the game, ultimately released on April 28th, 2004, which, if you notice, that is a long time after 2000. This game was in development for 4 years. Every other game that this team had made had taken less than a year to develop. So this is, Clannad was like a huge, massive undertaking by this company. Clannad, upon its release, reviewed extremely well. It quickly gained a reputation as Key's best game and one of the best visual novels ever made, a reputation that still enjoys to this day. Finding sales data is very difficult, partially because there are so many different versions of Clannad, but it has sold at minimum 300,000 copies, which would be similar to Aaron Kanon. It must have sold a lot more than that, because I can't find good data for the English version, but since the English Kickstarter raised $500,000, it must have sold a lot there.
Well, and just the fact that it exists in other territories,
yes.
Like Kanon can't sell copies in America because it doesn't exist here, right? So it has to have sold more than Kanon by dint of that alone.
Yes, I mean, I know for sure it sold over 100,000 copies on PC in its release year in 2000, in like the second half of 2004. And I know that the PS2 version also sold 100,000 copies in a year. That's like the most reliable sales data I know for sure. So it must have sold quite a bit. I'm sure it is their best-selling game given all those other factors, particularly the English release. Clannad is available or was released on a crazy number of platforms, as all these games are when they get popular. So it had the original PC release. That release has just no adult scenes. There's no version of Clannad that has any adult content in it. There is a sort of pseudo-sequel to Clannad they made called Tomio After, which is a sort of after story, but for Tomio's storyline in the game. That does have adult scenes, but Clannad itself does not. Clannad was released on the PS2 in February 2006. That is the version of the game that had all the voice acting, so all of the voices we know, other than Tomoya, who was unvoiced because he's the protagonist character, all those voices come from that 2006 version on the PS2. Clannad then went on to release on Japanese cell phones. It has a PSP version. It is one of exactly 50 visual novels on the Xbox 360. It has a PS3 version. It has an Android version, a Vita version, a PS4 version, and a Switch version. As we just talked about, the Steam version, the PS4, and the Switch version also are all available in English. I found an interview from a 2007 poll on Dengeki G Magazine, which is a video game magazine in Japan. And in that, they had this big poll voting for the best quote-unquote Bishoujo game, basically dating sim game. It was very broad because Fate Stay Night was also in this poll. Clannad was voted as number 1, and it beat out Fate Stay Night, which was number 2. And there was an interview in the magazine for that poll, where Maeda Jun described Clannad as Key's magnum opus. It's basically how I'm translating the term he used. And he also described it as a wall that he will never be able to overcome. Basically, I think the production factors behind Clannad are pretty unique. I mean, it's very rare you get a visual novel that has 4 years of development, particularly in this period, which is like the golden age of visual novels. So, it has a huge reputation as a game. obviously, which kind of carries into the anime. In terms of the staff members behind the game, Maeda Jun, as we talked about, is the lead on the project. He's the main writer. Specifically, he wrote the common route, so like all the kind of combined stuff in the game. He wrote Nagisa's route, Fuko's route, Tomio's route, and then the main stuff in the After Story route. And there's about 2 other side routes that he did some work on. He also composed several of the tracks in the soundtrack. They also had a writer, Kai. He was the guy, he had previously written about half of Tono's route for Air. He wrote the Kyo/Ryo route, the twins, and he wrote some of the side routes. And then they had the writer Suzumoto Yuichi. He had previously written the summer route for Air, and he wrote Kotomi's route and then some of the side stuff. So then they had Tenkumo Genki and Fuji Tomotaka, who are also writers on the game. I didn't find details on what specifically they wrote. I'm guessing they just kind of like helped flesh out like scenarios in general. So a lot more writers worked on this game, and like, you know, a lot like of responsibility distributed. Even if Maeda Jun obviously had the vast majority of the work, it's a very big game. Lots of people worked on it. As with all their other games, the art and character design, once again, is headed up by Hinoe Itaru, and the soundtrack is the same people as well, Orito Shinji, Maeda Jun, and Togashi Magome. So all the same people that did Air and Kanon there also were the people working on Clannad.
And it's a huge amount of music. Like, just to say, like, I have soundtrack collections for all of these, and there's a lot of soundtracks for Air and Kanon, but like double that, and that's how much there is for Clannad. There's just so many collections and remix albums, and which means that the show has a shit ton to draw from, and it does not have the problem Kanon had at all of like sometimes you felt like they're using video game music. This just sounds like a soundtrack written for an anime because they have a kind of bottomless like pit of music to draw from.
Yes, well, the full soundtrack for the game was 3 full CDs,
yes.
And then there's like a huge number of different remixes and other music that they also did. They have the music from Tomio After and stuff, so yes, it's a lot of music to pull from. So yeah. Other stuff I just want to point out, just because there are a lot of other adaptations and stuff here with Clannad. And so if people are curious, if they've been looking it up and want to know what some of the stuff is, Clannad does have a series of side stories written by members of Key, which were released from 2004 to 2005 called Official Another Story Clannad, Hikaru Yamamoto Sakamichi Day, or like the light which watches and protects on the hill, the road on the hill. I didn't translate it, but that's like generally what that subtitle means. So these short stories would later get adapted into a drama CD. The audio from that drama CD would then get used in a like pseudo visual novel that added art and stuff to it, and that has been bundled with later releases of Clannad, including the English version. So if people are curious what that kind of those other side stories are, that's where all this comes from. It comes from the side story light novel project that then got turned into kind of like a pseudo visual novel. So if you buy the English version, you'll get that as well. Those also have received a manga adaptation. Clannad itself has received 2 separate manga adaptations that ran concurrently for a very short window, and they are different adaptations of Clannad, which is like crazy to me. I mean, they're both like from like 2008-ish to 2009-ish, and it's weird. And like one of them has like 8 volumes, the other has 6 volumes. So if you want to read Clannad manga, I don't know if they're good, but you have 2 different options to pick from. There is also a separate manga adaptation purely of just Tomio's route that is called Tomio Dearest. So if you want to read Clannad manga, there's a lot of it out there. Clannad has had a set of 5 drama CDs made. So each heroine had their own drama CD, which are basically just like radio plays that are their own separate side stories for each of the heroines. So if you know Japanese, you can seek those out. Key released their fan disc sequel I mentioned earlier, Tomio After It's a Wonderful Life, on November 25th, 2005, which is an expansion on Tomio's route. And then, of course, we have our other anime adaptation that's not the KyoAni one. There is an animated movie adaptation of Clannad, which is produced by Toei Animation, which was released on September 15th, 2007. This is basically the same thing that they did with Air. It's basically the same team. Osamu Dezaki is directing just like with the Air movie. And like with the Air movie, the concept was that this is a quote-unquote another Clannad. So it's its own take on the story from the game. Though from what I understand, it is more faithful to the game overall than the Air one was, which made some pretty huge changes to that story. But the movie is still fairly different. Obviously has to cut huge amounts of content. So it was very free to kind of be its own thing, while KyoAni was also making their TV adaptation that's much more faithful at the same time. So that's what that movie is, if people are curious about that. So that brings us into that KyoAni adaptation, which is our kind of main feature for today. So Clannad by KyoAni, this show aired from October 4th, 2007 to March 27th, 2008, with an additional episode, Another World Tomio Chapter, which debuted on the final DVD volume, which was on July 16th, 2018. And that also was shown theatrically at like a small venue that was like a little like Clannad Fest, basically. Which is
Do you mean 2008 there? You wrote 2018.
Yes.
I assume it did not come out 10 years later. Yeah.
You are right. Yes, 2008. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes. Clannad was KyoAni's 7th TV anime following Lucky Star. So at this point, KyoAni is like full bore. They're making like 2 TV shows a year. So the
stuff that they've been making at the same time as the Key stuff is what we're doing in the next part of this season, right?
Yes.
Suzumiya Haruhi and Lucky Star and stuff.
Yeah, so by this point, they have already done Suzumiya Haruhi Season 1, and they have already done all of Lucky Star. So both of those shows have aired in their entirety at this point. The overall approach to the project was the same thing as the earlier ones. Was them wanting to be as faithful to the game as possible, pulling like music directly, all that kind of stuff, the exact same process. One major difference, though, is that given the size of Clannad, this adaptation is a total of 4 cores of anime with a 6-month separation between the ending of Clannad and the beginning of After Story. So it's a much longer adaptation, though it is adapting a much longer game as well. The director Ishihara is the one who made the choice to organize the show specifically around Nagisa's route and increasing her presence across all the other story arcs, and then making the reestablishment of the drama club, which is from Nagisa's story, that becomes the central axis of the show's plot. And in an interview with Shimo, the writer, he specifically pointed out like this was like a thing that Ishihara was really like fixated on, like this is how we have to make this show. And I think it's like one of the key choices was that then means that all the other characters get to continue to persist across the whole show, because it's all focused around them all becoming friends with Nagisa and working with the drama club, which is not necessarily how the game is framed, because those are all separate routes.
Yeah, we'll talk about this more with the show, but I just want to say, like, I have a whole bunch of stuff on this in my notes. This, to me, is the thing. This is the thing that I think this show unlocks over Kanon and a bunch of other visual novel adaptations, is just the persistence of the characters, and specifically Nagisa is the co-lead. This is not like in Kanon, you'll go long stretches without, what's her name, the main girl in that one. Ayu is like, she'll be around, but like you will go without her, and it's not until near the end that like she really comes into her own. That's not what they're doing here at all. Nagisa is in every single episode alongside Tomoya, and I think that's like the masterstroke of the show on a writing level.
Yes, and that was like a thing that they were very like, this is the thing we have to do with this. One of the consequences of that is that the Kyo/Ryo route and the Tomoya routes are dramatically shortened from what they are in the game, though like both of them get their own OVAs. We'll talk about the Tomoya one today. The Kyo/Ryo one, that is the OVA that they made for After Story that adapts their ending. Obviously, the thing is with both those stories like their fundamental concept relies on those characters being in a romantic relationship with Tomoya to make that story work, which is obviously why they can't be adapted into this show, because it would like, unless you wanted to make Tomoya a complete scumbag, it just wouldn't work. And so the Fuko and I'm blanking.
Ichinose?
Ichinose, Kotomi route. Those ones don't need to have a romantic element. In fact, in the game, both of those have a non-romantic conclusion, which the Fuko one, like that is like the choice, like the specific artistic vision for that one was a non-romantic conclusion. Like they added a romance option later for Fuko because they assumed that people would want it, but that's not the original version of the story that was written. So those ones can coexist just fine with Nagisa. Kyo and Ryo and the Tomoya roots can't, but to make up for that, those characters are very present across all the other stories anyways. So it's like, one of the things I think that's good about the show is that even if they don't have a huge 5-episode story arc dedicated specifically just to them, they don't feel like they're a sub-tier of character or anything. They feel like they are as relevant and active as any of the other characters in the show, which I think is one of the strengths of the writing here.
Yeah, I just, again, having no association with the visual novel, I think watching it, you can just feel that they are making active adaptational choices that sometimes are tough choices, because maybe there's material you have to leave on the floor or put in an OVA, but it's making the strongest version for, I think, all the characters together, and I think it's perfect.
Yeah. So Clannad was a huge success when it came out. The DVDs for Clannad were the 4th best-selling anime DVDs of 2006. Immediately above that was Lucky Star, number 3, and number 2 was Double O Gundam. Number 1 is a thing that I think nobody will have heard of. It's this show called Usavich, which was like hugely popular in Japan for like a weird period of time. That there are a series of comedy shorts on MTV Japan. So they're like a weird anomaly. They sold like an insane amount, but everything else was like, there's like, Clannad is about twice as much as the previous one, which is also about twice as much as Kanon, and then Lucky Star is a bit more, Double Gundam is a little bit more. So you're like in that kind of top tier of sales there, and obviously KyoAni having 2 at the same time is pretty fucking crazy right there. So it also outsold Kanon in Air. Kanon by a fair margin. Air was very popular, so Air was close, but Clannad outsold all of them. There was also a promotional web radio show, which I desperately wanted to find episodes of this, but I couldn't find any online. I managed to find some for some of the later shows we're going to watch, but not this one. This web radio show was called Nagisa and Sanai's Rainbow for You, or Omaini Rainbow, which is pulled from an Akio line from the show. And it was hosted by Nagisa's voice actress Mai Nakahara and Sanai's voice actress Kiko Noe. That aired for 52 episodes from October 2007 to October 2008, and then they immediately got an extension for an additional 26 episodes called Nagisa and Sanai's Hyper Rainbow for You, which was from October 2008 to April 2009, basically covering all of After Story as well, which I like these kinds of, they're basically podcasts for anime with the voice actors. They're usually very fun. But it is very unusual for one to have this number of episodes. Like, it's fucking crazy getting basically a year and a half worth of episodes out of this promotional web radio show. It's one of the reasons I wanted to listen to it, is it must have been pretty fucking good if it was actively ongoing, even in the 6-month period when the show was off the air. Yeah, then a couple of other little things I pulled out from the interview from the fan book. Ishihara regretted when they adapted to Aaron Kanon that a lot of the comedy in Aaron Kanon had to be cut out or trimmed. And so he was really kind of glad that they were able to focus on the comedy and really pull up the comedy more in Clannad, which from what I understand, the game is funnier as well. But that was something that Ishihara talked about in his interview, that he was really proud of the comedy stuff they did. Shimo, the writer, talked about the significant effort being made to try and balance the comedy and serious parts of the story better, and that being a focus that he had as a writer. Ishihara,
you can totally feel that in the show. That's a big one, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Ishihara also felt that one of his favorite elements of Clannad as an anime adaptation was the way in which the friendships between the characters were portrayed. For example, Kotomi gets to stick around and continue to hang out with everyone even when her arc is, like, quote-unquote finished. And that's, like, one of the things he really likes about the show. He talked about in the interview, and we kind of talked about that. That's, like, I think huge about the show. Ishihara's favorite episode was episode 18, and his favorite scene was the ending with Kyonryo. That's the episode where at the end, like, Nagisa comes back after she's been sick. At the end, Kyonryo realized that they kind of have no chance with Tomiya. It's like one of the best episodes of the show. That was his favorite one. And he felt that the way that they incorporated the ghost characters into the Nagisa-focused story worked out well, provided an important point of development for Tomiya. One of Ishihara's favorite jokes was Tomiya sticking the straw in Fuko's nose. They asked everyone in this fan book what their favorite comedy scene was. That was his. And the original version apparently didn't have any milk dripping out from the nose, but when he did checks on the storyboards and on the Genga, on the drafts, he decided to add that and felt that Fuko is the only heroine in any game that could get away with milk dripping from her nose and still be cute. And that was my favorite part of the interview, was him saying that. And then I love this detail. So Shimo talked about, he talked a lot about how hard it was to write the show, because again, Fumihiko Shimo, he wrote every episode of Air, he wrote every episode of Kanon, he wrote every episode of Clannad. Motherfuckers are going to go and write every episode of Clannad After Story. He's some sort of monster. And he talked about this show being very hard to write for, because I think it's, a challenging adaptation, but like one that they just really nailed. He was incredibly grateful to Tsunohara, because he thought that character made writing any scene that character was in, he said, was basically a lot easier to write. He compared Tsunohara as being Jerry to Tomiya's Tom, which I thought was an incredible comparison.
I actually do think it's a big thing this show has that the other ones don't, is it's the volume of characters, and that some of those characters just are so much more prominent. Like, Kanon has some, friend characters on the side, but they're pretty minor, and Tsunohara is just a main fixture of the show, and I do think that, I would think as a writer, it would make like Okazaki a much easier character to write when you have a best friend to bounce off of that's that fluid. Like the male characters in Air and Kano don't have anyone like that. And I think it makes the Tomoya just a much stronger character just by dint of Tsunohara being there at all.
Yeah, it's one of the bizarre things about Kanon is that they do have a character that's effectively the Tsunohara of that show, which is the Tomokazu Seki character, but he's not friends with Yuichi, the main character. Right. He's friends with the sister of one of the heroines. And so it's like, it was just so weird to me how kind of removed that character was, because the best friend of the protagonist character is such a cliche classic character in this sort of thing. I mean, that goes back to Tokimeki Memorial, where that was like the guy in your classroom you go to and you ask him, hey, like, what are my, basically, like, what's my, like, affection level with all the girls? It's like the kind of classic character in the more dating sim focused ones that gives you all that info. It was just weird to me that Kanon has that character in such an awkward position, where Tsunohara is like the best version of that character type. In terms of the staff here, obviously it's basically the same as Kanon. Ishihara Tatsuya, again, is the director. Fumiko Yoshimo is, again, the writer. The chief animation director and character design is once done by Ikeda Kazumi, who did it for Kanon, although that was different for Air.
I did want to ask about that, because the character design philosophy on this show is very different than Kanon in terms of how they draw the characters. So I was actually surprised it was still the same person. We can talk about that more later, but I think it's interesting. Yeah. They go for a very different kind of drawing style, which I actually think works beautifully, but it's something to note.
Yeah. I think it's a combination of like their process getting better, and then also I think the fundamental like designs and some of the art of Clannad itself is like a more mature version of Inoue Hitaru's art, and so I think that like kind of helps it as well. That like I think the original character designs and stuff are just better from the game, and I think that makes these characters get to work better. In terms of episode directors, this is one of my favorite parts of doing research, is looking up all the people who direct episodes. We've got mostly it's a bunch of people returning from previous ones. Ishihara Tatsuya directs episodes 1 and 4, both of which are fucking phenomenal episodes. Kitanohara Noriyuki, he was the guy who did, particularly I liked episode 3 in Kanon. He did that one. He does one of my favorite episodes in Haruhi as well. He did 4 episodes for this, episodes 2, 7, 13, and 19. Kigami Yoshiji directed episodes 3 and 9, with 9 in particular. That is the last Fuko one. Aratani Tomoe, who she was the one who was the character designer on Air. She is also the one that later goes on and becomes the Nintendo Cinematics director. She directed episodes 5 and 11, 11 in particular being great. Tako Noriko, she was the director who was that first-time director that did the Shiori episode that was storyboarded by Kigami. She did 4 episodes here, 6, 12, 18, and then she did the Tomio one, which is fucking amazing. I mean, obviously that one also is like movie-level quality, but the storyboards and stuff on that are incredible.
It's a directorial like masterwork. That's definitely like I would have assumed that was like a Hishihara Tatsuya one just because of like the amount put into it, but that's really cool. It's so good.
Yeah, and she also does the OVA, the Kyoto one from After Story as well, so that's something to look forward to there. Ishidate Taichi, he's our Violet Evergarden guy. He does 3 episodes, 8, 14, and 20. Takemoto Yasuhiro, our other major director, we'll be talking about pretty soon with some of the Haruhi stuff. He does 10, 16, and 22. 22 in particular being that's the last normal episode of the show. That's obviously a big standout. Yoneda Mitsuyoshi, this is the first time we're talking about him. He was an animator who had worked at KyoAni since 1999. This is kind of like a Takeo Noriko situation. He directed episode 15, but the storyboards were by Sakamoto Kazuya. And so that was his first time directing something. And then episode 21, he did both the direction and the storyboards on. He regularly goes on to direct episodes and a bunch of stuff we'll talk about up to Nichijou, at which point he left the company. He's kind of like an independent. He just like works on a bunch of different stuff. And then a really big thing here is this is the first show where we now have Yamada Naoko moving into director position, which she's the one who will direct K-On! As her first full show that she directs. Episode 17 is the first episode she directs, but like with Yoneda, that one was storyboarded by Sakamoto Kazuya. So clearly this is like a pattern we're seeing now with like Naka Doriko in the previous show getting this. They're doing this with 2 directors here. And then episode 23, the kind of like bonus episode that takes place after the end of the story over the summer vacation, that one is both directed and storyboarded by Yamada Naoko, and that's the first episode she has full control over that kind of director.
That's fucking wild. Of course she went on to direct full shows, because 23 is like It's so good. It's directorially stunning. All of these are. But I actually think one of the cool things I see going through the list of directors you make each time, Sean, is that, like, they're really good at not just, like, keeping the big ones for the big names. Like, they will give a big episode, like 23 is the last one of this season that aired on TV, to a person. This was their second episode of television, and I mean, not that they'd ever worked on, but that they had directed, and first that they had storyboarded. That's cool. It's a lot of, like, it's a little trial by fire, but in the best way. I think it's very neat.
Yeah, and it's cool to see this system of them doing, like, okay, we'll have you direct this episode, but the storyboards will be handled by Sakamoto Kazuya, who he directed, like, a bunch of episodes of Air and Kano. He didn't direct any episodes for this one, but he did 4 storyboards for 3, 15, 17, and 20. So it's like, we'll have them do the storyboards. You need to focus on just the direction side, and then for the next episode you will do both of it. Obviously that works out really well, because all 3 of the directors we've seen do this have gone on to do really good stuff, particularly with, obviously, Yamada Naoko. I mean, when I realized that episode 23 was her, it's like, you can see, when we get to K-On!, I think you will see so much of the DNA of that show in this episode, because there's a bunch of very K-On!-ish moments there. But yeah, and then all of those episodes, other than the ones I pointed out, like those couple ones, they're all directed and storyboarded by the same person, with the exception of episode 2, which is one of the Kitano Hata ones. That one was storyboarded by Ishidata Taichi. As I said, Sakamoto Kazuya did 4 storyboards, 3, 15, 17, and 20. So lots of, obviously, great people with the direction and the storyboards, and it is, as I talked about earlier, just like an incredible masterpiece of a show in every element, but particularly, like, the visual side of it is just out of this world good. So it is very fun when you go through the credits list and just see, oh my god, look at all these people, look how good they are at their shit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we will talk a lot about it in a little bit.
Japanimation Station.
Thanks for listening to Japanimation Station. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to like and subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell your friends.
You can support the show directly on Ko-fi at the link in the description, and remember to check out the Weekly Stuff podcast, our long-running series on movies and video games and everything else on all platforms.
And now, back to the show. And so I think that's it for my history section here. We'll get into the music later, on which I have my notes here, but yeah, like with Kano, this is broken up into story arcs, although I think, like, one thing that's nice is the story arcs are much more fluid, so we can kind of take this by story arc if we want. But you have the common route, which is episodes 1 through 4. Fuko has her route, episodes 5 through 9. Kotomi has hers, 10 through 14. They kind of combine Kyoto and Tomiya into one sort of, like, super route, which is episodes 15 to 18, which I think was maybe the strongest section of the show in some ways. The Nagisa route, obviously, at the end, 19 to 22, and then we have our 2 kind of bonus episodes. So how do you want to tackle this, Jonathan? Do you want to have anything you want to do, like, kind of big picture, or do you just want to break into the story arcs?
I do want to talk big picture. One thing I want to say about the arcs, though, is that, like, I actually think a strength is that after the Kotomi stuff, I wouldn't personally break it up into routes. I don't think it's acting like that. Like, you talk about 15 through 18 as, like, Kyo, Ro, Tomoyo. You do have them all there. I would say, like, the spine of it, though, is all Nagisa still, because, like, they build Tomoyo's, like, goal there is about becoming the student council president, but the reason why Tomoya gets into it is because they need it's a very political arc. They need to get the current president out of there because he's blocking the fucking drama club. So they need their own puppet in the government. And so they get Tomoyo. That's not really what happens, but you know what I mean. And so they get Tomoyo, and, like, it all feels so fluid. That's my point, is there is not a, like, clean break of, like, at these 3 episodes, and then we have to reset. Like, that's something in Kanon that I think at 24 episodes gets a little tiring, is just how many times the show has to climax and reset, and those resets can be pretty abrupt. And I think even when you do have clearer arcs, like Fuko is an arc with an ending, Kotomi is an arc with an ending, there is not that same sense of the, like, brutal reset, in part because when, like, Kotomi's story, quote-unquote, ends, in the next episode she's there with everyone and is a character, and it continues and everything's fun. And when you get into the Kyo, Ryo, Tomoyo stuff, you're not, like, getting to know them for the first time. We've known them for 14 episodes. And I think it's just one of the overall, like, structural strengths of this show is that it never feels like it's divvying itself up in any particular way. It's telling one big story, focusing in different places sometimes. But even, like, the Fuko route, which is the most like something from Air or Kanon, like, you have all the characters in it. You are really getting to know Nagisa. You are like Hyo and Ryo get to know Fuko and they come to love her. And Tomoyo is in there through all of it. And so it is never wasting any character's time along the path. Everyone's there for everything, effectively. And I think it is structurally like the thing that elevates this over the other shows.
Yeah, and it absolutely is. It creates a show that is like immaculately paced and also so perfectly balanced. And I think that sense of balance is something that these kinds of adaptations struggle with for very understandable reasons, because it's like, how do you try to balance something that was meant to be 5 separate stories that you as a player just go off on your own volition and explore? How do you wrangle all that without leaving everyone's favorite stuff on the cutting room floor? And truly, like, that I think is the masterstroke of Clannad, is finding a way to take all that material, find that sort of core thread with Nagisa, and being able to find really smart ways to hook everybody into that. So like having the kind of running joke almost of all these people coming and living with Nagisa for a couple of episodes, which happens multiple times over the course of the show, ultimately within with Okazaki. Like, that's one great way to keep things kind of central around Nagisa. The drama club as a narrative device is perfect. And obviously that like exists in the game, but from what I understand, that's not a thing that's particularly relevant in the other character stories. So finding a way that's like, okay, Tomoyo has all the student council president stuff. That's her whole story because she wants to save the sakura trees. That doesn't, from what I understand, necessarily connect in the game to the drama club problem. And so finding those sorts of like natural ties together really helps it. And then I think making those smart cuts of deciding, okay, we can leave the romantic stuff with Kyoto and Tomoyo aside. We can save that material and do the OVAs, which is awesome. But for the main show, you can still make those characters really vibrant and important by just having them be present and interact with everybody and be active characters in the show. And so I do feel like the show doesn't have the kind of tiered character issue you sometimes get in these shows where you have like one or two you have like 1 or 2 characters that are on that top tier, right? Like, this show is fundamentally about Tomoya and Nagisa. Like, those are the 2 main characters. They're effectively co-leads. To say Nagisa's in every episode, I think, except for one of the episode. Well, no, because she's still she comes in at the end with the one that she's sick. That's the only time she's like absent for the majority of an episode. And so they are like the co-protagonists, but below them, all those other characters are on that same tier of importance. It's not like Fuko feels like she's a more important character than Kyo. It doesn't feel to me like Kotomi is a more important character than Tomoyo, just because like her story arc gets to be a little bit longer, more centrally focused on her, because it's like, well, Kotomi's not as active in all the stuff that comes after as Tomoyo is, who is really active in all the stuff that comes after, even if she doesn't get just a 5-episode story arc on her. So that sense of balance of like all the characters feeling like they're equally weighted, equally important. You know, Kyo is a character who doesn't get a big 5-episode story arc, and yet I quickly found when I was taking screenshots of episodes, I screenshot something with her in it like every fucking episode, partially because she might be my favorite character and she has like the best facial expressions, but also because it's like she's so active and brings all the characters together. So that sense of balance you get is so important, and I think it's one of the things that just elevates this show so high. Every character is interesting, every character is funny, every character is dramatic, and every character kind of bounces off of the other characters in a way that's really interesting, and they get to be present and active throughout the whole show. Even if, Tomoya and Nagisa are the main focus. And that's just a thing that no other adaptation of this kind of visual novel I've seen has done. Obviously, you have something like Fate Stay Night, which is a fundamentally different kind of visual novel, but something like this with the 5 heroines that you can pick whichever route in whatever order, that kind of thing. Nothing does it as well as this. Nothing else even gets close.
Yeah, and Fate Stay Night, as hard as that show is in a bunch of other ways to realize on screen, narratively it's quite a bit simpler because
yes.
you can do one and then the next and then the next. They didn't like overcomplicate it for themselves. Like, Ufotable did not make the crazy decision of like, how do we do Unlimited Blade Works and Heaven's Feel at the same time? You just don't. You do them individually because that's how it's built to be. This is logistically on a writing level, a much bigger challenge, I think, and they really rose to the occasion. And you can just feel the experience that builds into it. I also think this is just something that I noticed this morning. I finished the main 22 last night, and then I watched the 2 bonus episodes this morning. And I just noticed, like, I think Shimo's writing is gorgeous on this show. It's something I noticed, like, the subtitles on the Blu-ray are great. They tell you everything. But there's something like just knowing enough Japanese to like understand how like the grammar is constructed and knowing where they are using certain phrases that like in translation just can't quite be like fully fleshed out. I would just constantly be like, that's a striking sentence. That's a beautiful sentence. That's very funny the way they said it. Like I think there's one... there's some joke in, I think, episode 23 where they're talking about it's one of the mini jokes in the bakery, and Nagisa has this line about, in the translation is basically just like, I will learn from this, but it's like, no, it's like, benkyou shimasu, like, I'm going to study what you are doing, and it's so much funnier in that context. There's things like that.
Yeah, I think, and I suspect, obviously some of that is pulling dialogue from the game, and then some of it probably Shima's original writing as well. But yeah, like the dialogue across the whole show is so sharply written. And I think in particular for the comedy, that really comes out. Like that's the thing about Clannad, is that it's an incredibly funny show. Every episode I was laughing my ass off. And I think it's a thing that it's so balanced perfectly here. We'll talk about, obviously, After Story is going to get heavier in dramatic material, partially because it's like After Story is about these, most of After Story is Okazaki has graduated from high school, right? So it's like about these characters kind of trying to become adults now and moving out of high school. So that's going to be one of the major tonal differences. Although After Story still has lots of really, really funny stuff in it. So don't just think it's like only sad or whatever, but it's going to have heavier dramatic material. But I think with Clannad season 1 here, one of the things of that sense of balance in the show is the tone of it is so well calibrated. Of it can be raucously funny, and it can also have like kind of these kind of tear-jerking, very dramatic moments. But it is not going for like the big knockout punch, and that's one of the big problems with Kanon. Is that Kanon for every single story arc was trying to throw a big like haymaker knockout punch, right? It's like Makoto's storyline has to have you in tears. Like every one of those character storylines has to be about like, she already tried to like slit her wrists in the past and she has a mortal illness, and all that kind of stuff. It's like every episode or every story arc in Kanon is incredibly heavy material, to the point where once you get through Makoto's stuff, which is really well done, but so heavy and so much better executed in its dramatic nature than the later storylines, the other storylines are almost comical by comparison because they're going so far with some of that stuff. Whereas in Clannad, there's some sad stuff here and there. Like obviously Fuko's storyline is probably like the most because the character is actually in a coma, but you're not focused on the sadness. You're focused on like kind of the magic of what's happening with these characters and building these connections, and what that gives to these people and these teenagers as they're growing up. And so I think the show, for like the dramatic side of it and the sad or kind of that more kind of classic, the Nakige, the key side of it, in this school section, it's pulling its punches a little bit, or it's like it's pacing out its game plan. It's not going for like, I need to knock you on your ass flat, crying in the corner every single time we build to a big dramatic moment. It's like, no, this is a dramatic moment that should land. It should make you feel emotional. You move through that emotion and then into the next section of the show. And there's something so kind of like hopeful and powerful, I think, about the show in that perspective. Like you're working through some dramatic material and some sadness and some darkness for these characters, but you always see that like hopeful light on the other side of it. And it's so framed from that perspective. And that just, I think, makes the show much more uplifting, makes the drama work better, makes the characters and the themes and that side of it work better. And that also means that the comedy has so much space to just be raucously funny. And you avoid, I think, the problems that like I had with Kanon, but you really had with Kanon, Jonathan, of like it just feeling like emotionally manipulative at a certain point because of how deep it was going into that territory.
Exactly. So I was keeping notes on this through the Fuko arc because the Fuko stuff is the most similar in this season to anything in Kanon or Air. It is, I mean, Maeda Jun and the people at Key like their stories about girls falling into comas and wandering the world. I don't know if that's an actual, the wandering the world thing, I don't know how many people are in long-term comas in Japan, if this is a common thing. Everyone walks out and it's like, I gotta go visit my brother who's in a long-term coma, and is astrally projecting all over Japan. But anyway, in the world of Key visual novels, it happens all the time, and Fuko's story is the most similar. But the presentation of it here is so different. Like, one thing I noticed, like, in Kanon, when the Makoto stuff hits, there is no comedy anymore, right? Like those final couple episodes where she is dying in his arms, there are no jokes, there's no laughter. We have shifted, we tonally grind to a halt of tragedy. And then part of what is so violent about the shift afterwards is going back into comedy after that, right? There's no smoothness to it. But like there's a lot of smoothness in everything that is happening with Fuko here, where like I notice, like I think it's at the end of episode 6 is when you get the revelation that Fuko's sister, the Yuko Minaguchi character, can't see her anymore. And in Kanon, that would be the point where the fun stops, right? And there are no more jokes for a couple of episodes. And instead, the one after that, episode 7, is one of the funniest in the whole series. That's where you've got the tongue twister competition between Okazaki and Fuko. You have Fuko and Nagisa doing their big competition of Starfish versus Dango, and they all both singing the songs and all that stuff. And at the end, that's where you learn that Fuko's doctor thinks she'll never wake up. But it's like it all feels natural and character driven. And then the one after that, you have another like big emotional moment, and it's starting to come in. And there's still comedy, and I think it leads to something like the end of episode 8 is where Sanai is tearfully telling Fuko, "Hey, we're all family here." And that like hits me, I think, more naturally, where I literally wrote in my notes here, Sean, I don't feel like I'm being manipulated. This feels really deeply earned and organic, not reverse engineered to make me cry. And I think that's like, that's the effect of having like life going on as these things are happening. And then again, the Fuko story is fundamentally a little different, where like, I don't think the end of her story I would even call sad. I think it is ultimately like triumphant and beautiful. Like she is still in the coma, but she manages to pull off, and through Okazaki's efforts and everyone's efforts, this amazing, beautiful thing where her mark on the world is like extremely profound. And so I think the story from the visual novel is also going for something different there. But either way, the like continuity of the comedy next to the sadder parts, I think makes the sadder parts feel more earned, and I think it makes the comedy funnier. Like all of it being blended together. You know, the last line of the big Dango family song, the ending song in this series, is all the sadness and all the happiness of the world together, and that's what Clannad is, and like it does it so beautifully.
Well, this is where, like, I mean, so in the Japanese community, there's an expression which is Clannad wa jinsei, which is Clannad is life. And that's, I think, is like, it's, you know, part of that also comes from like, you know, the fact that After Story continues and it goes beyond where these kinds of stories normally end, right? Where it's like, okay, now they're in a relationship, then what happens, which will be fun to talk about. And that's what contributes to that expression. But I think it is also about it being that. It's that it's like, it's all of these things together, all mixed together in the way that life feels, that things aren't ever just purely sad. Things are never just purely happy. It's always like a complex mixture of all of those things. That's very much what I think Clannad is going for. And it's I think let's just like stick with the Fuko stuff since we're talking about it, because it's such an interesting comparison to make with Kanon, because obviously the very direct comparison is Fuko and Ayu, right? Because these are both adorable little girls that are coded as being very young, even if like they're, you know, not supposed to technically be that young. Like I think Fuko is actually older than Okazaki, maybe, like because she would have gone to the school, or maybe she'd be about Nagisa's age. But she's like in the same age range as these characters. She's not actually literally supposed to be younger. But she's coded young. They're definitely like a little bit more kind of extremely, like a little bit goofier in the way that they talk. Fuko doesn't have an ugu. Like, luckily there are no ugus. We've moved past the ugu phase of character writing, and people get to be sort of like interesting outside of having weird verbal tics. Like there's a couple of small ones, like Kotomi sometimes ends her sentences with nano, but that's so minor compared to occasionally just going ugu all the time.
Yeah, and Fuko is younger. She's a first-year student, is the idea. Yeah. But like not radically younger. They're all in the school together, but yes. Yeah,
because I couldn't remember at what point she was meant to have entered the coma. But yeah, so she's, you know, a little bit younger. She's got that kind of like a quirkiness and that goofiness and that comedy to her. And then you find out, okay, she is this girl who's in a coma astrally projecting her. But I think there's a couple of things that frame this so much differently than the Ayu stuff. And I like the Ayu stuff. I think that's a good character in Kanon. But I think I talked about in the podcast how like I think Horie Yui does a lot of heavy lifting to make that character more interesting than she is on the page. And this is what you see with Fuko. I mean, the vocal performance for Fuko is fucking all-time legendary great. But like the character as written, if you played the game, it didn't have the voice acting. The character on the page, I think, is really well done, very interesting. Because there's a couple of things here. One, she has no pre-existing history with any of the characters. The closest thing is that Nagisa knew her older sister when she was a teacher for that 1 year that Nagisa, before she was held back. But Fuko is not this like, this girl that I loved and then this tragic thing happened, we got separated. It's like, it's not pulling on all of that kind of stuff. She's totally fresh and has no relationships with any of these people. So she's starting from zero and building something naturally from there. And then the biggest thing for me is like, you learn immediately. Oh, she's she's introduced with like, there's a rumors about there being a ghost girl, and then this weird girl shows up out of nowhere and she's got like wooden stars that she says are starfish that she's handing to everybody. And then you immediately, that transitions into the characters basically realizing that must be referring to her. Nagisa believes it more or less immediately. Okazaki takes a little bit of convincing, but the audience is meant to understand this is this ghost girl who is in a coma, and I guess she's not a ghost, she's actually projecting, but like, that all that stuff from the jump. Whereas one of the things that Kanon does that kind of drove me a little bit crazy in the early parts of that show is that it codes that with Ayu so heavily. She's got her angel wings on her little backpack, all that kind of shit. But the show doesn't actually reveal it until the very, very end. You get lots of little teases, like Ayu being in the hospital and the nurse seeing her and doing like a double take. You get the mom's reactions to Ayu are always like kind of like, oh, she kind of knows that there's something funky, that like she shouldn't be here. But it doesn't give that to the audience until the very last story arc, where it's like Fuko, it's set up immediately. This is what this character is. She is a girl who's actually projecting herself into this school to try to, for her older sister, because she wants to invite everybody to her older sister's wedding, because she wants to make up for the stuff of her older sister not being able to being worried that she won't be able to get married and all this stuff because of what's happened with Fuko. That's all stuff you learn in like the first episode, basically, of the Fuko stuff. And then the story grows from there. And so that's one of the things that gives it this really hopeful feeling, is you don't have this comparison point of like knowing this character when this tragedy hadn't befallen her. You don't have the like pre-coma, you don't have the pre-accident Fuko to compare it to. So there's something about all the stuff with the Fuko that your frame of reference is, all of this is a miracle. Like from the jump, this is something magical Fuko is trying to make happen that shouldn't even be possible. And therefore, what is happening, even if she failed at it, it would be sad. But it would be sad because you didn't get to achieve this thing that you wanted to achieve that should have been impossible. Not because like something that should be here that you expect normally, like a character's life and their safetyness and happiness, is being taken away from you. Right? So there's like a fundamentally different perspective here, where it's so much more positive in its fundamental framework and outlook. And I think that's something that I just vastly prefer in this kind of story, just because it's so different. You've seen dozens of other shows and movies and stuff, whether it's anime or not, do stories like the Ayu story that are the much more tragic version of this thing and frame it that way. Where I think it's really rare to find one that is so upfront about its nature and not trying to sort of save the reveal of Fuko's magical shit as like a gut punch of like, oh, how sad it is that this character maybe is dead. It's not trying to play any of those games with the viewer. There's no big surprise twist where you think Fuko has died, like Yuji thinks Ayu has died at the end of Kana, and then it reveals, no, she's actually just in a coma. It's not trying to play any of those games with you. It's just trying to tell the story it's trying to tell with the character. And that, I think, just shows a really big maturation in the storytelling process. I think it's also notable that the Fuko route is written by Maeda Jun. The Ayu one was not. And I think that like Maeda Jun is fundamentally a more interesting writer than the guy who was the lead on Kanon. And I think he has like a more interesting perspective on how to use some of these characters and write some of these kinds of stories. And that just translates with how they adapted it to the anime beautifully.
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. If you put it all out on paper, just from season 1 of Clannad, I'm sure more Fuko in season 2 somewhere, but in season 1, Fuko does not wake up. it is on that level not as happy, quote unquote, as what happens with Ayu in Kanon, where she does miraculously wake up at the end. But my memory of the two shows is that Kanon in all of that kind of felt like a wallow to me. And this one, even though Fuko doesn't wake up, feels like beautiful, life-affirming, inspiring, you know? Yes. I think at its worst, the Key stuff can feel like a little bit of a wallow, not affirming your investment in the series, but punishing you a little bit. Even Air, I think, at its best, there's some stuff that's just like, it wants you to hurt, you know? Mm-hmm. And I think Clannad wants you to feel. And I think that's a different thing. Feelings can be big and complex, and they can involve hurt, but they don't just have to involve that. And, like, it's so triumphant. Fuko's efforts cut through to literally everyone in the world of this show. Her sister's marriage happens. Her sister, who is clearly a, like, good person who deserves happiness, is allowed to be happy and move on and marry this super cool dude who we see in, like, 2 scenes, but he's awesome. Everyone would want to marry that guy, right? And there's a real affirmation of the emotions the characters in the audience invested in all of this. And even if the ending of Clannad in After Story were, oh no, Fuko never woke up, she died in her coma, they still gave her this beautiful dream, which is what she says before she disappears at the end of episode 9. And she still had this, like, immense impact in the real world. There's that line at the end, she gathered blessings for you and we loved her. That's the best line of this show so far. It's unreal. And the big climax is Tomoya exclaiming, you know, please be happy for her sake as well, to the sister. And that's the big difference. The point isn't to wallow in the hopelessness of all of it. Coco has that line, if we continue to be happy, she can be happy too. And that's, to me, this really beautiful statement about the relation between the dead and the living. Because I think while it's a coma, I think code-wise, it's actually more death. It is more a little bit like a ghost, a spirit from the afterlife helping those she left behind. And it feels so meaningful and cathartic to me. There's also, in terms of the pace of this show, I think a really important gesture they make at the top of episode 10, the first one after all of the Fuko stuff, where Tomoya is now calling Nagisa, Nagisa.
Yes.
He's using her first name. And that only happened because of Fuko's intervention in the drama room where she made them start doing that. And in that moment, even though the characters don't remember Fuko right now, it acknowledges that it all happened. And it tells the viewer very clearly that this mattered, it changed these characters, and that impact will continue. And even if we didn't have the fun scenes where Fuko comes in and does her goofy starfish stuff, her impact would still exist in the world. And that's a big difference where, like in Kanon, the Makoto stuff does eventually come back in and pay off, but in the immediate aftermath, it might as well have not happened. And that's part of what's so jarring. They do it perfectly here.
Yeah, and obviously, like, the Fuko storyline with the characters forgetting about her gives them a good excuse of, like, it's obviously, like, that's a very clear one to put first, because it's like right. the fallout from that storyline can be contained easier because the characters can forget about her. And, you know, I think it's really important that they do have the Fuko master sections where she does come back and do her little goofs, because that character's so funny, you don't want her to just be gone. But the characters aren't sort of like wallowing in their sadness about the fact that they can't see Fuko anymore because they've forgotten that stuff. But as you say, her presence has made a difference. And that's like the core theme of that whole story is it's about how like the impact you have on the world and the people that you make connections with persist even when you are gone, because that is both what is happening with the older sister, Coco, and it's what's happening with Fuko, right? Coco's connections and like the things she did in the life she built as a teacher working at that high school. And obviously I am also a high school teacher. So that like some of this stuff like felt very, I'm a high school teacher who lost my job at the previous school I worked at, which is the first school I worked at. And I've got like complicated emotions about that. So some of this stuff hit me in a particular way, but Coco's relationships and the things she did at that school, even when all the people other than the staff at that school have no connection to her anymore, right? Other than Nagisa, all the students have graduated that she was with. The things that she did there mattered in that place, and that like the echo of that lingers, like literally in Nagisa being there, and then also literally in Fuko, right? That's the thing, that Fuko has this like magical anchor to hold on to, which is Coco's desire to get married at the school, which now seems impossible because both like enough time has passed and everything that's happened with Fuko. And that has sort of created this place where it feels like spiritually Fuko can be there to make that dream come true, and that those echoes of Coco's work as a teacher there allow all the rest of this to happen. So that work and that thought and care and the time and the pain and the love and all that you have for a place and for a thing you have done will persist past the memory of that. And then that's obviously Fuko and what she's doing with the stars fish are the exact same thing. But there's something so, I think, beautiful about that message of like, even if the people forget it, and there's nobody there that will say like, I know and I remember that this is like this because this person was here. Like what you have done spiritually, like emotionally, whatever, it persists and it helps people and it makes the world a better place, even when you have moved on and even when the people you knew have moved on from that place. And I will say that is like, you know, some of this theme of I talked about in the Clannad history section about one of the main themes of Clannad being it's both about the connections between people, but it's also about the connections between the people and the place that they live, the town. Like that theme, the town part becomes a lot more front and center in After Story. That's one of the places where After Story is going to be different. This is one of the places where it seeds it, though, is that that like what you have done here has affected this school and this place. And I think that is the beautiful thing about the ending of episode 9. As you say, Jonathan, like they have all forgotten Fuko directly. Nobody there can stand there and say, Fuko, I remember her and we did this, and that, and the other thing together. But Tomiya now calls Nagisa Nagisa, and when anybody looks at a little wooden star, they all think that it's a starfish. They don't know why, they just think that it is. And like that's such a sort of powerful moment. That's this like small little miracle that Fuko makes because her thoughts and her memories and her emotions and her efforts have left behind an echo in this place that she was. And that's like such a beautiful story.
It's perfect. It's amazing. Fuko herself is obviously such an incredible character, but yeah, and I think it's the way it brings literally like the whole cast together. You know, they keep, it is not just Okazaki and Fuko together through all of that. It is him and Nagisa. She is fully the co-lead through all of that. And so you have both of those characters. Like that's the first big thing they bond over as a couple or as friends is their relationship with Fuko. That is the thing, like that becomes this thing that distracts them from the drama club because they love this crazy kid so much and they want to do this amazing thing for her. And it eventually brings in Kyo and Ryo as well. Tomoyo is around the edges. Even Tsunohara is around the edges of all of that stuff. And so it is also like the perfect arc to introduce us to all of these characters. Like this gets into a main character arc faster than Kanon did. Kanon has a longer common route at the beginning. It has 6 episodes of that. But it doesn't feel like this has less of a kind of common area at the beginning because the Fuko route is kind of pulling double duty as that because it is where we get a sense of community for the first time.
Yeah, well, and you don't have the thing in the Makoto route where there's like a solid 2 to 3 episodes of that show where it shuts out almost every character other than Yuichi and Makoto, and to like a lesser extent Naoki, the cousin. But like it becomes so hyper focused on just those 2 characters, which is one of the things that I think is like gives you that whiplash effect when now it's like, okay, now we just have to zoom all the way back out to the full cast again, minus Makoto. It's like bizarre. Whereas there's no stretch of the Fuko story where you're forgetting or leaving behind any of those other characters. They're relevant and pop up throughout the whole thing, particularly Kyoryo and Tsunohara. They're present the whole time. There's probably not a single episode in that whole stretch where they don't appear. And so it is, it keeps you engaged with the full cast and the whole scope of the show. It's not just, okay, this is just, Tomiya and Fuko. And that's one of the key things is, from what I understand in the game, like a lot of those big moments, Nagisa is not present for. Like one of the main things that like a lot of people pointed out in the interviews I read, just because they thought that like it was so well done, is the scene in episode 9 at the beginning of them in the school at night, the night before the wedding, having their little party. In the game, that's just Tomiya and Fuko. But they added Nagisa in, and then obviously that whole dynamic of that's where they start calling each other by their first names all that stuff is an invention of the anime in order to integrate it into the full scope of the Nagisa story as your main anchor. But it feels so natural that as an anime viewer, I could have probably guessed that it would be kind of weird for Nagisa to be here in the game context when it's supposed to be, just like you kind of like picking this one character story you want to go down. But there's nothing that feels odd or unnatural about her presence in the anime. Like, that's what that scene is partially about, is about Fuko leaving behind, just as she has left behind the starfishes for people, she has left behind this connection for Nagisa and Tomiya as well. And that just is so perfectly integrated into the rest of the scope of that story.
Also, it's funny as shit. Just all of it. It's so funny.
Yes.
She's this little girl who we meet because she is furiously carving starfish. And, Tomoya has to come in and be like, you're hurting yourself. And then she's like, no, I'm fine. And he does all these games with her, like having her do the high five. But to do a high five, she has to pretend to dribble the ball, shoot, and then high five, because that's her context for basketball and high fives. And all of it, it's so funny. It's so adorable. The starfish thing, it's like a less sad version of like the Thousand Paper Cranes story, right? Although also more effortful, because I think carving starfish out of wood is probably harder than making origami paper cranes. But it is like, kind of the same idea. But I love how it, like, everyone gets in on it, because this is also where you get a ton of stuff with Nagisa's family and her parents.
Yes.
And all of that is integrated because Fuko comes to stay with them, and the parents, who are the best parents in the entire fucking world, are like, yeah, let's make all these starfish. Let's go crazy and do all of this. And they kick Tomoya out and be like, you go run the shop. We're carving starfish. And it's funny, but it is also beautiful and adorable, because that's also where you get the real sense that, like, Akio and Sanae are like parents, but parents to everyone. Like, they love their daughter, but they want to build an inclusive space. It reminded me a lot, honestly, of like the stuff with the house in Fate's Stay Night, of like the idea of the household where everyone is allowed to come, and it is this really welcoming place where community and found family is built. And that is very much what the Furukawa Bakery is in Clannad. And again, that's something that I think we get set up through the Fuko stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, just like the comedy with Fuko is 110% on point. It is so fucking funny. This is where you have to shout out the voice actress here, Nonaka Ai, who, like, this is just such an incredible performance. I haven't actually seen a lot of her big stuff. Like, has been a main character in a couple of really big series. That's just ones I haven't watched. So she's the female lead in Sayonara Zetsubo Sensei, which is a really popular show from around this time. And then also the Negima series. She's one of the main characters, Konoe Konoka, from that. I haven't seen those shows, but there's like a dozen of them. I know the Negima series is really popular. Of stuff I have seen that she features in, she's Sakura Kyoko, one of the main characters in Madoka Magica, and then a personal favorite of mine, though this is a character that only kind of makes noises and grunts and doesn't have lines. She is, in the Fate franchise, she is Frankenstein's monster, which that is a servant that is modeled after, like, the Bride of Frankenstein. And
that's great.
She's in the spin-off Fate Apocrypha, but then she's obviously also in Fate Grand Order. And I fucking love Frankenstein's monster in that game. It's just such an adorable, great character. She does appear as this very weird character called Tirami in Amagi Brilliant Park, which is a KyoAni show we're not covering, but if people want to see her in another KyoAni thing, that is a very funny, weird character. And then one weird detail I learned when I was looking her up, that there was a very short-lived, like it was for like a year, there was a voice actress idol unit, basically like a pop group called Drops, which was led by Mariko Koda, who's the voice actress who played Naoki in Kanon, and she was a part of that for like a year. So that's a weird, yes, that's your Ainonika trivia, but yeah, even though I haven't seen her in a lot of other stuff, like, this is such a incredible performance. Like, the character, I think it's really delicate trying to find that balance of the character is so ridiculous and she's hilarious in how ridiculous she is, but there has to be like an anchor of like a real person in there. It can't just be completely totally nutso, and she just like walks that line so perfectly. The character is completely believable. Like, you can absolutely believe that a person like this could exist, is this kind of quirky and weird and just loves starfish so much. She's definitely an oddball, but she still feels like a real person to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the comedy role of a fucking lifetime. All the scenes in the second half of the show where she is coming in and doing her Fuko extra help thing or whatever it's called are amazing. I think they're all great. My favorite one is probably the first one where they're trying to get the thing out of the claw machine and she comes in for her pinch hit on the claw machine, but instead she just grabs a starfish and says like, I'm sorry, my hand went on its own, and then she runs away with her starfish. And I love that in every single one of those she comes in to help, doesn't help, but is amazing and amusing anyway.
Yeah, they're all great, because you have the first one where she tries to do the starfish heat, which is her super special attack, but then she realizes she can't do it because both of the parties involved attended her older sister's wedding. She's like, well, I can't do anything, so can I leave now? Yeah, okay, bye, and she runs away. And then when the delinquents go and attack the school in the Tomio arc, she appears, and then she's like, now I can finally actually do my starfish heat. And then you learn that it is because she hid a bunch of her starfish carvings around the school. And now that everybody knows that she has done that, surely they will be possessed to go and have to try to race to go find all of them. Nobody gives a shit. She realizes, oh, this isn't working, and then she just leaves. It's incredible. And of course you have the all of Tomiya's pranks on her are the best, and him sticking the fucking milk straw in her nose is great. I think probably my favorite is the one where he like has her close her eyes and he's like quote unquote switches places with Ryo and convinces her that he's like done a Freaky Friday basically. And then he just like switches back, and that's where you get some of the writing where they're like talking around the fact where she's like, wait, do you have a dick? It's like, wait, can I have a dick? Like, what's happening here? It's very good.
That scene, I just about died. That scene is so good because Tomoya, I love how much playfulness it brings out in him, because he is a fucking goofball, but often he's a goofball with a little more, angst. But like with Fuko, the full goofball comes out, and it is so fun. And again, it's why I think positioning her first helps so much to establish him as a character as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And while we're talking about Fuko, we just have to episode 9, which is the last one. This is the big one directed by Kigami Yoshiji. I've got in my notes here for us, Jonathan, some of the screenshots I took from that episode. Like, holy shit, that fucking episode, just visually on like the storyboarding and everything, unbelievably gorgeous, like top to bottom. In particular, you have the opening scene, which is all the stuff in the school at night, and then there's a bunch of that scene that then they like light the candles, and the way that that's animated, and the use of like the orange color with the blue night outside is so well done. And then you got on the flip side, you have all the stuff with the big last scene at the wedding, which is also just some of the best stuff in this whole show visually, with all the shots of Coco, her older sister, in the wedding dress. And then they do this like interesting kind of filter over the image in that moment where Fuko appears and Coco is able to see her for the first time. And they're almost kind of like glowing. And Fuko gives her sister the starfish, hugs her, and then disappears into like a wind swirl of sakura petals. And there's this really beautiful camera move as Coco turns her head and looks up to the sky as the petals fly away. Again, it's like it can move you to tears, but not because of how sad it is, but because of how beautiful it is. And what a just outstanding visual masterpiece that episode is.
Outstanding. I also want to give a shout out to the great Yuko Minaguchi as the sister here. Small role in the overall scope of the show, but like absolute. I mean, she's one of the greatest voice actresses of all time. She's amazing here. Because that character has to do so much, I think, emotional heavy lifting through those episodes. And she's just outstanding, particularly in that last one.
Yeah. Also, I'll say, and I shared this with you, Jonathan, that visual fan book has selections of some of the storyboards, and it is very fun to see some of Kigami's storyboards because of how unbelievably clean they are. Like, it's just so, his storyboards are so fucking smooth. It is very cool. Again, if people Google around, it's pretty easy to find those scans online. And it's worth taking a look because his storyboards are just like some of the cleanest I've ever seen. And I do like looking up storyboards for these kinds of shows, and his are just really good.
It is something I really enjoyed. And it's why I would like to find more of these storyboards at some point, because everyone's style is actually pretty different on this show for the storyboarding. Some of them are like none of them are like, they're all great, but you can see they all kind of come at it from different angles. And you're right, Kigami's are like, he does not have any background detail in his characters are pretty like, not super detailed either, but they read so powerfully. And again, just the movement from like shot to shot in those is gorgeous. And then some other ones are like extremely detailed to the point of almost looking like a manga. I love seeing people's different storyboard styles. I love looking at storyboards in general. But yes, you are right. It was cool to see the legendary Kigami at work in there.
Yes, and episode 9 is definitely, I think there are a couple of episodes that are in contention for like my best episode of the show, but episode 9 is definitely in that. Like it is incredibly good.
So I have another couple of kind of like high level things I want to talk about with the show before we break more into some of the separate arcs. But while we were just talking about animation, let's talk about the animation on this show for a second, Sean.
Okay.
So we can follow through on some of these thoughts in the different arcs. But like, Clannad has the best character animation I've ever seen for a TV show. I don't think there's even real competition on that. It is so wildly fluid, and it is full of all these little like micro expressions and small movements in the characters. They've definitely streamlined and simplified the character designs a bit compared to Kanon and Air. I think much for the better. They're a lot less busy, and as a result, I think they're a lot more striking and memorable. But they're also doing something a little similar to what Mamoru Hosoda does in his movies. Not as radical as what he does, but Hosoda's style is all, let's make these character designs as simple and streamlined as possible, make them open to being off-model, and then we are just going to have way more frames of animation than you normally would, so that we can have like maximum fluidity and animator expressiveness. And this is the thing I love about Hosoda's movies. Hosoda's movies have my favorite anime character designs in movies. I love how those look. There's something very similar going on here, not as radical, but again, you have that feeling where it's like the fluidity and simplicity of the designs means that you're really appreciating the animation, not just the drawings. And what I mean by that is the sense of the follow-through and physics and momentum of the motions and all of that, and how the characters are performed through motion, which is what animation is. Animation is multiple drawings expressing a bigger idea, and I think you really feel that here. It also means that the animation can be a little rougher, a little looser, in the sense that the models are just looser, so the animators have more freedom to experiment, and that means just in every episode, you can really feel the hand of the artist at work bringing these characters to life. And it is the thing that is like most striking to me about this show on an aesthetic level is just how above and beyond they are on the character animation and what choices they've made of what to emphasize. And these are the kinds of character designs I love most in anime, I think, because you can feel the hand of the artist in it just so fluidly.
Yeah, and it's all that like fluidity also comes from how good they are with all the secondary motion on characters, particularly like hair is obviously like, I think a particular trademark of KyoAni is like how they do hair in clothing. And on like a TV show level, that's usually a lot of the stuff that, you know, it's very hard. It's very like sort of like, you know, grinding to try to animate all that stuff when characters move. Obviously, it's like you have your head moves and then your hair moves slightly slower than the rest of your head, or you raise your arm and your arm's going to move and then your shirt like sleeve is going to fall a little bit after. And they're so good at capturing a lot of those little details of all the secondary motion that happens in slightly different speeds and stuff on your body when you move things around. And that's one of those things that creates this really physical anchor for the character. And it's such a trademark of KyoAni's style, and I think it's something that we've seen, you know, watching some of this early stuff, them kind of building up that skill set of that production pipeline and the directors and the animators and all of that getting better at it. And here we're like fully in the golden age of KyoAni, right? They've done season 1 of Haruhi, they've done Lucky Star, now we're in Clannad, they're going to be doing season 2 of Haruhi in the movie and stuff. And then moving on to Hyoka and Nichijou, like this period from like 2007-ish to about 2012, I would say is like the height of KyoAni stuff when like their stuff was the most popular and the most successful. Obviously, like the stuff after that is still fucking great. But this is like that kind of really focused golden age period for the studio. And you can really feel it in just how, as you say, like every piece of detail of the character and how they move feels so natural and so considered by an artist. And it does just lead to the facial expressions of the characters in particular on this show are fantastic. It's why when I was taking screenshots, in particular with Kyo, who's a character that just has like the most expressive face, and then Fuko is the other one. Like it's if you go like some of the animations just like frame by frame, every little facial expression, the movement of the mouth, the movement of the eyes, all that stuff is so meaningful for them. And so that level of like the acting of the character through the animation is phenomenal. And I think it's what makes the characters here, it's one of the things that gives them that spark. Like, I've talked a little bit about, like this kind of moe thing that KyoAni is getting into, and how he will do it more. K-On! Is going to be like the apotheosis of moe for anime in general. But I think in Air and Kanon, I haven't actually really felt that for any of the characters in particular. Probably the closest is like Naoki and Kanon. I thought like some of like we talked about like that gap moe concept, that for that character kind of got me a little bit. Here, particularly for Fuko and Kyo, like I just love those characters. Like you put that character in a scene and have them move around and I'm happy. Like, I'll just look at them and I'll be happy. Like, I want to get a poster of Kyo making, like, a ridiculous expression or Fuko doing her little dance or whatever. Like, those characters are so appealing in their design, in their motion, in their expression, in their personality, their writing, their voice acting. All those elements come together to create a single character that, like, just sort of, like, really springs out of the show and like just feels alive. And that to me, I think, is a real fundamental concept to moe, that like excessive appeal of a character that just makes them feel almost real to you. And that you can just like, they're characters that you can imagine scenes, and the scenes just write themselves. Like you could put them in a scenario and you can imagine exactly how that character would behave and how they would act and move and what they would say, because the character feels so real to you. And I think that's a fundamental piece of what moe is. And I think basically every character here like is really good at that. For me personally, is Fuko and Kyo are the two characters that like, hell yeah, these characters. Like if this is a Clannad gacha game, I would be rolling for those two characters. They'd be getting my money for Fuko and Kyo.
They're great. But yeah, it's like this show really is, and I think comparing it to Air and Kanon, which to be clear, I think KyoAni did a phenomenal job with the character work on. But I do think as a combination of them maturing as a studio and Key maturing as a studio and having better character designs in this one, I think this is a real object lesson in how less is sometimes a lot more. That I think simplified character designs where you're really focusing on like, kind of what matters most to identify these characters. And it's, it's the eyes and it's some hair and it's some just general things that you can use. And then what really matters isn't so much the model, but the expressiveness of the animator through it. Like, Clannad has like 4 characters with purple hair who are wearing the same uniform. It should be indistinguishable. I will say in Kanon, there are definitely characters I get confused because they look kind of similar and there's a lot of similar details. But like, you don't get Kyo and Ryo confused in this show. And they look, if you just, I think, brought up the models on a static screen, like the drafting sheets, they're very similar designs. But I think as drawn, in part because they're stripped down enough that the animators have a lot of leeway with what to do in the performance, you never get confused watching it. They're all so distinctive, and that's a real skill. And I think it's also something, as we're talking about kind of the industrial side of KyoAni, this is a real benefit of having a studio that's doing all of this in-house. It is the same key animators working consistently on stuff. It's a pretty small set of directors, as we've noted each time, who are doing the entire show and storyboarding it. And so there's a real, like, kind of ownership of, I think, the characters in the animation, in the sense that, again, if you're doing a big show that's airing every single week, like your One Piece or your Dragon Ball, and 5 different studios are farming out to do it over and over again, right? Then, like, your character models are, like, really important, and I think your animators are going to have just a little less leeway to have that performance because no one necessarily has that ownership of it. But you can really feel it in Clannad, and the way you can in, like, in an American context, I would say a lot of, like, classic Disney movies where their whole pipeline was that they would have one animator was, like in Aladdin, one animator was the genie, and that was his job, and he did it. And in the cast, they would even credit it as Robin Williams, voice of the genie. This guy is animator of the genie, and I always think that's a really cool way to do character animation because it is like you're the actor of it. And I think Clannad being again KyoAni's whole sort of in-house, close-knit, very experienced process, you can feel that kind of experience at work in it.
Yeah, that's the thing that makes those characters pop in that way. And yeah, I think you're very right that it is partially that there's such a consistency of vision across everybody shared because it is so close knit, that it allows that looser style.
Yeah. Also, the backgrounds, Jesus Christ.
Oh, yeah.
They are unreal. They were great in Air and Kanon too, but it's one place where I think you also see them making a leap. There's so many of them to start with. Like, the show is not shy about just breaking out backgrounds everywhere that are like very elaborate, but they're beautiful. I love how heavily the brush strokes are in the images, and you can see the paint. There's watercolor, there's, other kinds of paints being used, and it's just, you can really see every little stroke. It's one real benefit of the Blu-ray. If you're wondering, like, what's the difference between streaming and Blu-ray, I do think, like, being able to see the, like, texture of the backgrounds and stuff, that's something that tends to get simplified when you've got a lower bitrate and are streaming, and on the Blu-ray, it's just so solid in front of your eyes, looks so gorgeous. The whole color design of this show is incredible. It's a real knockout.
Yeah, I like you point out the backgrounds, because that's another thing that I noticed. I think you're right. Like, the Blu-rays really make it stand out because it resolves that very fine physical detail of it, that you're like, oh yeah, I'm looking at like a painting, where I'm looking at something that has this really kind of physical quality to it. And I also like they make such good use of these sort of like shared like sets. Basically, we've talked about this before, particularly with like Kata no Kyokai, where you have like that quote unquote set that is Shiki's room. And obviously you don't actually have like a physical set that you build, but you have like, you have a space, and you've kind of designed this space out for characters to be here, and you reuse the space. And sometimes you'll reuse that background, and you'll reuse like specific shots across episodes. And there's two in particular in this show that I think are just so well done. One is there is that kind of area in the school courtyard where there's like a couple of trees and these like rocks in a circle around it that you have Tomiya and Nagisa sit on, and you revisit that shot in that like place over and over throughout the whole season, and you have like different characters assembled there, they'll have lunch there and stuff, but you're kind of in that same space. You reuse some of the same shots, you reuse some of the backgrounds, but have different characters do different things, and you can feel the passage of time through that. And then the other really big one, this is my favorite one, and I would actually love, like, if I had like infinite time on my hands, it would be so fun to just do a time lapse of every time they use the shot in the club room, which is in like, it's like from the opposite corner, where the camera's in the opposite corner from the door and looking towards the door, and the door is kind of in like the right hand third of the frame. And then you have the table in the middle. They use that shot consistently throughout the whole season, whenever it's like one of their main establishing shots for the club room, which is such a great set and space. And the first time you get it is in episode 1, when that space is full of clutter and all the boxes and stuff that have been left behind by the earlier club. And then that's also the last time you see that shot is in episode 22, where now it is just it's Tomiya and Nagisa come back there again. It's just them, none of the other characters, and it is now flooded with that almost like ethereal sunlight, like kind of sunset, beautiful pinks and blues and stuff. And that shot is so perfect. It is just so well constructed and considered for how it kind of establishes that space, and you get so comfortable and used to seeing that room from that perspective. And then the way that like the room slowly changes, and the people that are there and the things that they do change throughout the whole season, is you just kind of feel the passage of time and the building of these relationships just through that physical space, through that like exact consistent shot. And it's so well done. This is not like, this is not a thing that Clannad has like invented, reusing shots and reanimating on those backgrounds, but this is like the best use of it I can think of in anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like having sets in a live action movie, right? And it's something that the best shows are going to be very creative in how they make use of that. And absolutely, I think one other thing that I can feel is a difference in this one that feels like something that Tatsuya, the director, I think Ishihara Tatsuya made a real clear effort on, is that this one just is quite a bit more pared down than Air or Kanon on what like kinds of shots it is using. The camera is more static. It doesn't go for, not that KyoAni generally does a lot of like big 3D shots, but there were more in Air and Kanon of like, we're gonna turn this environment a little 3D so we can do a more elaborate camera work. This one is like, Clannad is like very strict generally on like, we're sticking in animation theory what I would call like an animatic zone, which is the idea of like the animation stand, and the camera is static and we're looking at an image and it's all kind of like still camera positions. There's a lot of creative camera positions in that, but it's generally emphasizing what the animators are doing on the plane of the animation in that kind of like flat space, and not trying to kind of get fancy with the camera itself. And I actually think it's a strength. I think some shows you want to get fancy with the camera. Ufotable can tell you all about it. But like, I do think like this is what KyoAni's strengths are, and I think Ishihara Tatsuya has a very good sense at this point of like, what can this crew do best? And I'm going to direct and we're going to storyboard in such a way as to emphasize those things. And I think you can feel them kind of pairing off some of the things they tried in earlier shows and being like, we don't need to necessarily go in that direction here. And it's just part of the maturation of a studio as they do more and more.
Yeah, and then the handful of times where they do go for more dramatic camera movements, it stands out more because they're only used in very special circumstances. Like I mentioned, the one with at the end of episode 9, where Kogo's head turns and then the camera kind of swings up with her. The biggest one is in episode 1, where when Tomoya and Nagisa meet at the bottom of the hill, and it's sort of, the colors are washed out and everything, and then they finally make eye contact and the colors kind of explode, and the camera does this really big sweeping movement where it pulls out from Nagisa and then swings around behind Tomoya's shoulder, so it kind of goes from the right, swings back left, and like ends up on the left-hand side. And it's like a big, very dramatic, really cool-looking camera movement that is accompanied with this huge sweep of wind and everything. That's obviously this huge moment of these two characters meeting that's going to echo throughout this whole show. And yeah, those kinds of really dramatic moments stand out more because they are only doing that big camera swing stuff or like really complicated camera movements in really specific scenarios. Most of the time, as you say, it's very locked off. It's using these kinds of really nicely framed shots, but kind of sticking to those shots and exploring those spaces that way. And like I said, like sometimes reusing those same shots to establish the same space that then highlights that difference because you're seeing the same framing every time. But it's very disciplined in how it approaches those things.
Yeah. So just on that aesthetic level, what a fucking show. One other thing I wanted to talk about before we go break into more of the arcs is just Tomoya himself, Okazaki, who you'll notice I keep calling Okazaki, and it's purely because Nagisa always calls him that, and so that's in my head the name I heard the most watching the show, even though I'm going to probably call everyone else by their first name. But yeah, Tomoya, this is another thing that like right off the bat shot this way above Kanon for me, is that Okazaki is not an outsider. He is the same as everyone else. He's not just like nominally their age, which is like in Kanon, Yuichi is nominally the same age as everyone, but no, he's not. He's like, he is so much older in spirit and in body because all the girls in Kanon look like they're between 8 and 10 years old, and he looks like he's 20, and it's kind of weird. And it's like, I know that's like there's a trope around that, but it doesn't fully land for me. I like that like Tomoya feels like an actual high school boy. He feels the same age as the other characters. He's lived in this area. He has experience with it. We're coming into the story, and he's already been there. And there's a value to the, sort of Yuichi transfer student thing that Kanon is doing, but I think it is something that makes Clannad feel like a world so much more off the bat, is that it's a world that Tomoya is part of it. It feels so lived in when your protagonist has been there all along. And then the character just is so vivid and human and funny, but also complicated. It's by far the best version of like the video game first-person character adapted to anime that I've ever seen. The only competition would be the Persona 3 main character, I think, in the Persona 3 movies. But like generally when you have your visual novel hero or your RPG hero who is by design a little less fleshed out than the other characters in the story, I think you can feel it in the anime adaptation. I think you can feel it with Yuichi to some extent, where he just at some point becomes like, again, superhumanly empathetic and helpful to everybody and all of this stuff, where you can feel like, he's a video game hero, right? Persona 4, the animation has fun with this on Yunaru Kami being a fucking weirdo, and so they just really like amp that up. The Persona 3 movies do it best because they make it a real character arc, why the character is such a shutoff. But in this, like, Tomoya doesn't feel like a video game character. He feels like the hero of an anime. It is such a fleshed out character. And then, of course, you have the superhuman charisma of Mr. Nakamura Yuichi doing the voice. It's just such a triumph of a main character, and it's something that, like, is so important to this show to me in a way that, like, immediately elevates it above some of the other stuff we've watched.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, one of my enduring memories of Clannad from when I originally watched it was What ended up being episode 2, I could have sworn that this happened in something like episode 4 or 5, but it's one of those things where I think the story just feels so lived in. But the at the end of episode 2, you have the reveal that he's been abused by his father, and as an injury of that, he can't raise his right arm above his shoulder, and so he can't play basketball anymore. And I remember when I originally watched the show being like very struck by that moment, because I had seen a couple of other shows sort of like this at that point, and all of them had super vapid, vacuous main characters that are there as avatars for the viewer to just sort of insert themselves into, in the vein of the main dude in Kanon. And it's like, that is just not what Tomiya is at all. And it's, while like I knew that the voiced version, because I always just knew this, that the character was non-voiced in the PS2 version of the game, it is kind of surprising when you watch the show and look at it from that perspective, that it's not like Fate Stay Night, where in Fate Stay Night, when they went back and they made the voiced version of Rialto Nua, Shiro, the main character, is voiced because he needs to be. Like, you can't do Fate Stay Night. He's as much of a separate character as anybody else. He's not a void for the main character to fill. I mean, that game doesn't even start from his POV. You play like 2 hours from Tosaka's POV in that game. So it's like, it makes sense that they would, for that, decide, okay, we want to have all that character's dialogue voiced as well, because he's, even if he's your main POV character, he's a character that should be voiced like anyone else. And really, I do think that Tomiya, at least the way the show presents him, I don't know how he's written in the game and if I would have a different impression from there, but just from the show, he feels like a person. He does not feel like a void for the main demographic of the audience to fill themselves with. And that is exactly what Yuichi from Kanon feels like. I like that character, but I like that character because Sugita Tomokazu does an incredible vocal performance, and his charisma as an actor builds that character in the exact same way that Horia Yui makes Ayu in that show way more interesting than she otherwise would be. Whereas, like, Tomiya is just an interesting character as written, but then obviously you do have Nakamura Yuichi voicing him in one of his like early really big roles. Back when he, I kind of missed this era when both him and Sugita were playing these like boyish characters in romantic comedies, because it's you're not really casting Nakamura Yuichi in those roles anymore. Obviously, we have talked about him a lot on the podcast. I went back and I tried to figure out how many.
We've talked about him an obsessive amount on this podcast. Yes. Let's be honest.
I was curious how many times he's come up, and I went through. So he is Graham Aker / Mr. Bushido in Double O Gundam, which is probably the most memorable time he's come up for us, because we talked about him a lot in that show. He's E.O. Fleming in Gundam Thunderbolt. I had forgotten that he was in Build Fighters, but he's Riccardo Fellini, the Italian fighter with the really cool Gundam wing in Gundam Build Fighters. He's obviously Gojo Satoru in Jujutsu Kaisen, which is probably his biggest like role that people would know him for now. He's also Greed in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. He's Grizzly in Polar Bear Cafe. He's Han Jungi in the Yakuza series. He plays 2 different Han Jungis, one in Yakuza 6 and maybe a slightly different one in Yakuza 7. And then one detail I also love, not that we've talked about him in this context, but he is also the official Japanese dub voice for Chris Evans as Captain America, which
great.
I just love. It is very good. And so, yeah, we've talked about him a lot. We will also continue to talk about him, particularly in Hyoka, because he also plays the main character there, which is particularly fun because also Sakaguchi Daisuke, who plays Tsunohara, plays the best friend character in that show also. So we'll get that 1-2 comedy punch there in that show also, and it's very delightful. Then apparently he's also in Sound Euphonium. I haven't seen that show yet, so I don't know what character he plays. But when I looked up his credits, he's in that as well. And we're not covering Kobayashi's Maid Dragon, but he's in one of the main characters for that series, so he's obviously a KyoAni regular. The studio really likes him, and for good reason. He's really fucking good at this shit.
Sean, every studio likes him. I think he's an anime regular at this point. The Nintendo YouTube channel likes him as well.
Yes.
We've talked about that. No, I mean, we love Nakamura Yuichi. I had not seen, though, a lot of his roles from this period, where, as you say, he was like the, romantic leading man in shows like this. I'm more familiar with like either stuff like Gundam 00, where he is a antagonist, secondary, like the big breakout character over there, the weirdo, or like the modern stuff like Jujutsu Kaisen, where he's tearing it up as Gojo, which is probably going to be like the thing he's most remembered for, I have to imagine, because that character is so vivid. Season 2 is airing right now with all of the Gojo arc, so he's back in the well, as we're recording this, not as this is airing.
Yes.
I think that season will be done. But anyway, but I had not heard him in this mode. and it was such a joy. He is so good. He can, I mean, he's the kind of actor who can do literally anything you throw at him, and that's very necessary for Tomoya, because Tomoya is sometimes... He's often funny, but he's funny in different registers. With Fuko, he's a total goofball. With some other characters, he's much more deadpan, kind of playing off of them. And sometimes he's extremely serious, and he's got some real angst. As you say, episode 2, because just you saying that, I watched that like last week, Sean, and I was like, that's episode 2? I thought that was way later with the basketball, the shoulder revelation. But like, he has some real like heavy pain in his past. He is, as he is called many times, sort of a delinquent who doesn't go to class on time and all this stuff. He's kind of lost the will to be a part of the world. And really the reason the story starts with him meeting Nagisa is that's when he starts integrating with the world again, right? And so the character just has to play so many registers. And Nakamura Yuichi, again, unbelievably charismatic, but can also go to those like really deeply vulnerable places, can be very funny, all those things. It's a tremendous leading performance. On top of then, of course, I think the character also giving him so much great stuff to play. But I do think the show just is able to lock in around him in the way it's unfair to say with Air, because Air intentionally does not have a main character in that sense. But like it doesn't quite have that center. Kanon does not have that firm a center. Not that voice actor couldn't do something. He is very good in it, but the character as written just isn't that firm a center. But man, it's a legendary performance for good reason.
Yeah, and it is just, I think it's how real he feels. Like I think it's something that strikes me about watching the show a second time, because I'm much older. I mean, when I originally watched this, I would have been like 20, maybe 21. So I would have not been that much older than these characters, like a couple years out of high school. And now obviously I'm a high school teacher. So it's like my perspective on them has shifted. And it's really striking to me how much they do really feel like teenagers in this show, especially Tomoya and Nagisa, like in particular, just because you get like the most with both of them. But I think for both of them, they've really captured this sort of that teenage psychology of the kind of, not ill meaning, but this arrogance, right? There's like that teenage arrogance or that self-centeredness where they can kind of only see their own world. And they kind of can't break out of it, but you see both of them, both Okazaki or Tomoya and Nagisa, start to do it not because they can step outside of their own perspective and kind of objectively look at their own situation, which I think is just one of those skills that teenagers developmentally just don't have yet. Both, I think like in terms of experience, but then also just physiologically, they don't have that. Some of their elements of their brain, like their prefrontal cortex, are not fully developed yet. So it's like that's not quite all the way there. So they have that hard time of objectively framing their own experiences. But Tomoya and Nagisa start to be able to do it for other people, just not for themselves. And so you get this like running thing in the show where Tomoya is constantly saying to Nagisa this like, man, you only ever get really kind of like passionate when it involves other people. And he's kind of trying to scold her because she's never like really sort of passionate, or she's never sort of like putting her own needs and desires first. She's always putting other people first. And whenever he says that, I just like yell at my screen, like, who are you talking about? Like, that's what you're doing. That's all you ever do. That's like a thing the show is doing on purpose, is that is also Tomoya. He can't, he has shut his own self down so much. He can't see himself, and he can't like sort of get out of his own head and see his own experience. And from that more objective perspective, I think his relationship with his father is so traumatizing and difficult for him that he just can't look at it, and he can't understand why his dad is the way that his dad is, which is understandable why Tomoya can't sort of see it. But like he just, that's his dad is such a kind of like black hole in his life. He can't escape that experience. So, but when he's helping other people, when he sees other people in need and he can help them, he's like vicariously, I think, working through all of his own stuff. And it's just hilarious how he doesn't see the sort of hypocrisy in that he and Nagisa are the exact same kind of person. Both of them so have the impossible ability of sort of like getting out of their own space and assessing themselves objectively. Both of them have this sort of almost obsessive need to help other people because they can't do this for themselves. And that's obviously why they're a perfect pair. But it makes Tomoya a really interesting character because you feel that internal psychology. That internal psychology informs everything he's doing. It's why he plays pranks on people and he's the jokester that he is. It's why he doesn't treat school seriously. It's why he avoids his father and mentioning his father or bringing anyone around his father or his home whenever it is possible. And it is why he throws himself constantly into trying to help other people, because he's trying to heal himself and he doesn't know how to do it. And I think that just makes him such a rich protagonist character to follow in a way that is so much better than these other shows that we've watched and other shows in this genre in general. Like, because your most visual novels aren't trying to build a main character that way. Most of them want the main character to be vacuous. Clearly, like, my assumption is the visual novel for Clannad is very different. I mean, I know that it is, because I know what happens in After Story. There's, like, no way you would write the story for this character and have him be an empty void. But, like, it also just comes across so brilliantly in the way they've designed and written the show and paced the story and everything. He's like an incredible protagonist.
Yes, and that kind of stuff is exactly what I was talking about earlier, of him not feeling like the void character at the center of the game. He is so much a human being with all these complexities. But I think you cued in on this, as you would as someone who spends time around high schoolers. They feel like kids. Like, that's another thing. It's something that I think bothers me about a kind of character like Yuichi in Kanon, is at a certain point, I don't buy him as a teenager, and then him spending all his time around teenagers feels odd, right? There's just a little bit of, like, there's a disconnect there, and Tomoya is absolutely a teenager, and he has all these gaps, and he has also all these, like, wonderful things that the world has not drilled out of him yet, as a kid. And I think it's very much a two-sided sword there, but I think that's true of all of the characters. They, even at their most heightened, they feel like real kids, and the adults feel like real adults who have gone through some shit. And I think all of that together just makes the show feel so wildly lived in.
Yeah, and I think you just get it. Like, I want to talk about episode 1 here, because this is where you get a lot of this stuff. And episode 1 just, like, I mean, it really bowled me over, like, because there is, I think, when you go through all of After Story, there's an almost kind of circular thing that happens a little bit. But also, like, I just have such a strong emotional connection to the show that the first scene that starts with Tomoya, and has this, it's all the colors are desaturated and washed out. He has this whole narration about how he, like, hates the world and he doesn't care about anything. He's lost. He's a very apathetic person. And then he meets and he sees Nagisa at the bottom of the hill. The Nagisa theme starts playing, which is also the Dango Daikazoku song. Obviously, it's the same melody. There will be an insert song in After Story that is also incredibly powerful that uses some of that melody as well. And you get that, and then you see these two people meeting where Nagisa is trying to psych herself up. She does her thing where she says, like, anpan or something, like sweet bread. She makes, like, this, she says, like, what her favorite foods are, because she's going to promise herself to eat her, like, a treat if she does whatever she needs to do. She's trying to psych herself up to go to the top of the school and, like, to go to school again after she's been gone for a year. And they reconnect, or they connect there for the first time, and that eye contact happens, the world explodes into color, the camera sweeps around, you have the beautiful sakura trees. Tomiya's like, come on, you're going to be late, like, what are you doing? And then she falls behind him going up the hill. And it is just like, I had to pause the show because it's like, I was so swept up with emotion, because I think I had just realized at that moment that there is no, like, romantic couple in a piece of fiction I'm more invested in than Tomoya and Nagisa. Like, it's just these two people, and even just in this show, they're not even getting into, like, After Story, like, these two characters, their romantic connection feels so, like, genuine and earned, and you see, like, how well they sort of, like, work together and pair off with each other, and they kind of fill those, like, gaps in the other person and their, like, similarities and differences. They're so well designed as a pair visually and in terms of their writing and their characterization. And then there are all these, like, powerful emotional hooks with, like, the music and stuff, that I like had to emotionally, like, take a break for a second, process some shit, and then go back in. In episode 1, a lot of episode 1 was like that, because then you get meeting all the characters in the middle section of the show where it's mostly comedy, and then you have the scene at the end, which emotionally broke me also, where you have the scene where Okazaki goes to Nagisa's house for the first time and sees her family, and you see that before you've heard anything about his dad. Obviously, I already knew all the shit about his dad. And seeing him in that context, knowing his background, and it's the first time he's really understanding, I think, just how unusual or how broken his family situation is. I think he's like confronted directly with like the Furukawa family is like this sort of idyllically perfect family, right? They're meant to feel like this kind of perfect thing, but also it's fundamentally a pretty normal family, right? You have both mother and father are there. They're invested and care about their children's lives and working for like to help their kid. And they're happy, and Nagisa's happy, and they're all eating dinner together. Like, that's not an unusual thing for lots of families to do. Tomiya has just never had that experience. And it's like, if you watch that scene already knowing what Tomiya's house situation is like, it's so heartbreaking. But then obviously also the way that the show frames it is really powerful, where after that he goes home, or like he stopped, he takes like this long way to go home. He leaves and he's kind of like wandering around. He stops at a convenience store. He stops and sits on a bench for a while. And obviously when you understand the situation, it's like he doesn't want to go home. That's why he's stopping in all these random places. And then you finally see him at home. He opens the door. There's a really powerful shot of him sliding open the door, the light coming in from behind him into this shadowed room where the interior of the room is just lit on the left side by a TV. And his dad is like this shadow slumped in the corner. And Tomiya's shadow is projected into the room through the doorway lit by the hallway behind him. Then he turns the light on and sees his dad is slumped over in the corner, basically drunk. He runs out to go back to Nagisa's house. And that's where I think like that connection to Tomiya as a main character is like immediately built. Like you see just visually told to you, right? Like Tomiya's not narrating this stuff. Nobody's telling you, nobody's explaining this. You just feel through the narrative framing of the relationships of these characters, what he's experiencing internally, what he's sort of contrasting, and how he is kind of psychologically trying to cope with his home situation, avoiding going home as much as possible, avoiding mentioning anything about his home to Nagisa or anyone else, and him seeking kind of this safe harbor from Nagisa and her family, and then he continues to obviously develop that through the whole show. But that first episode and the way they built that whole dynamic between the two of them, obviously a whole middle section about them starting this whole drama club thing, it's just a perfect first episode. And that one is directed by Ishihara Tatsuya, and I think that's the best episode he's directed that we've seen so far of him like personally directing an episode, because the whole thing is gorgeous. Every shot is beautiful. The way it's framed and paced out, it's just a perfect first episode of a show.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I did not have the same kind of connection to it you had, Sean, obviously, because I didn't come in and know who these characters were. I was new to all of this. I didn't really even know what this show was about, broadly, other than it had high school kids in it. But I think it is still... I just felt something immediately in that first episode where I was like, oh, this is like a leap. This is something else. This is something new. I think the first time you and I talked about the show, we were recording a different podcast, and at the end I said, wow, Clannad is really good so far, huh? And I had only seen this in the second episode. Like, that was what I was going off of. And I was like, this is fucking amazing. And it was just like the previous night. I'd watched the first two and then gone to bed or something. And it immediately makes an impression for all of the reasons you're talking about. And like, just like going back and looking at like your screenshot gallery here, Sean, and remembering some of those moments just from this first season of the show that I've seen, it is so good at like setting up all of the major sort of things that are going to happen, as you say, especially the Nagisa Tomoya stuff and his home life and her home life and how those contrast. And I think, yeah, the scene that definitely got me most in this first episode was he sees this other kind of idyllic home. He goes back to his home and then he runs away and he goes right back to this girl he just met. But like, it made such an impression on him. Like, that's the kind of home he wants. I mean, it wasn't even clear to me in the opening episodes of Clannad where he lives. And I think that's kind of intentional of like, because you see him spending a lot of time in the dorm room with Sunohara. And it wasn't immediately clear to me that that's Sunohara's dorm room, not one they share. And that maybe he's just at home sometimes or something. And I think they don't stop to spell that out for you because he's a character who doesn't stop to think about it. He doesn't. Yes. He's very nomadic. He spends sometimes at that dorm room. He spends sometimes at Nagisa's house. He tries to be at his house as little as possible. And by the end of this first season, he has left home entirely and he is living with Nagisa's family. And he is like thriving as a person because of it, obviously. But it is such a compelling arc right off the bat.
Yeah. And then you also, while we're talking about episode one, one of my favorite comedy bits is the middle section of the episode, Tomio's introduction, where you have this like comedy version of this like biker gang with the guy with the huge pompadour, and you have this incredible shot of a close-up on his aviator sunglasses with Tomio reflected in them, and then the camera pulls out along his pompadour that frames the top of it like it's the fucking opening shot of Star Wars or something with the Star Destroyer. This is how ridiculously long this thing is. And then she just kicks their asses, and then Tomio, it's very fun, watching all the Tomio stuff in the aftermath of Street Fighter 6, because it's making me realize she's just doing Chun-Li's level 2 super over and over again to people, like the 100 kicks thing. And she just kicks the shit out of all these people. And then you get this amazing shot after she beats them all up and kicks their bikes into the air and all this crazy shit, where it shows it all from like the audience perspective of like an objective bystander, what they actually see, and it's some like Dragon Ball Z shit of like she just like appears, goes and then like everything explodes and it's like 2 seconds. It's so funny.
Tomio is great because she becomes much more down to earth as a character as the show goes along and as we get to know her. But in those opening episodes, she is like the most ridiculous character in the whole thing, because we're seeing her exclusively in these scenarios where she comes in and beats the shit out of these biker gangs, or Sunohara has the crazy obsession where he keeps trying to fight her and gets the shit kicked out of him, and then he's like, she must be a man in disguise, and is trying to trick her with like these word games, and she keeps getting back at him. Several episodes she's in the fucking bear costume kicking the shit out of people. It's so great. I like that they keep Tomio, around in the story before they have a story to tell with her, by having her be just so ridiculous and funny, and that it actually makes her, I think, an even more interesting character when we do get to the point where she is humanized, because we've seen this like crazy outlandish side of her.
Yeah, it's like she's like deliberately superhuman,
Yes.
This is like, she can defy the laws of physics. You get that great running gag of all the stuff with Sunohara, like the combos, and you have the combo meter in the corner. You have that incredible one of where she does the level 2 Chun-Li super on Sunohara, kicks him up in the air, and then Tomio like instinctively kicks him back, and the thing, like the frame pauses and it says combo connected on the screen, and then it goes back up, and then she does another combo on him, and it is great. Yeah, like all that shit in the first couple of episodes when Tomio pops up and just they do their little comedy bit. It's very good.
Yes. So I think since we were already talking about episode 1 and Tomoya and all this, we need to talk about Nagisa, and I think we should just talk about that kind of spine of the show, and then maybe go in and backfill some of the other characters and their material. But we were already, I think, building up to that. And I think you saying this is like one of the best romances in any fiction you've encountered, I totally understand. I agree. I think certainly in like an anime context in this vein, I've certainly never seen like partnership that felt this just ludicrously like palpable and real. And it is two people whose, as you say, the gaps in each of them fill in the gaps in each other. It's so fucking beautiful.
Yeah, and Nagisa is just, I think she's such a kind of almost like a Trojan horse of a character, where you on the outside, she seems like she is your very standard main heroine of a visual novel like this. But then I think the more you get into her, I think there's one element of it is I think they're kind of taking more seriously as a piece of characterization her like kindness as both a strength and a weakness. And that's the thing that I think, normally it's just like, the main heroine is just sort of like impossibly kind and well-meaning and can come across as fairly bland because of that. Whereas like Nagisa, again, like her kindness and her need to help people is something that also sometimes kind of hurts her because she's not taking care of her own needs. And she has this kind of like, this complex almost about she can't be hurting people, right? This is like what her story ultimately becomes about, is this fear that she has hurt her own parents by taking their dreams from them, and that she's worried that she's being selfish and doesn't want people to help her because she's worried that like that's taking things from those people. And I think the thing that the story and the writing in Clannad is so good about is that like that comes from the same kind of teenage arrogance as we see with all these other characters. It's just a much nicer version of it. But like her psychology is still this very teenage thing of like, she can't see how egotistical it is to assume that like she is hurting other people because those other people feel compelled to help her. Like that's so putting yourself on this like ridiculous pedestal and not being able to understand that like those people are getting something emotionally or whatever from helping you. They're doing it because they want to. And it's like that means that maybe they're sacrificing some other stuff, right? This is like their parents have to sacrifice some things to be there for their kid, but they want to do that. But she's, she has this weird complex, and it's just come from that same teenage arrogant place, and that same mindset. And like as a teacher, like I've seen kids like this. This is the way that kind of psychological teenage thing manifests for like honors kids and stuff like that. They're very nice, they're very well meaning, and they're very considerate and stuff, but that also can backfire on you. And that's like how I was as a teenager as well. Like I like recognize some of like what Nagisa's doing and how kind of futile and sort of self-defeating it is, and how like sort of misguided it comes from. But she can't see it yet because she's still developing. She's still a kid, and that's what Okazaki is trying to help her with. So that element of it, I think there's such a psychologically real core to Nagisa that really separates her from other characters in this model that I think are more just sort of they're only skin deep or whatever, as so much of what this sort of main heroine is. And usually the main heroine of these kinds of stories is just really dull and bland. Nagisa, it all comes from a psychological place. She feels like a real grounded person in this world that is learning how to grow. And I think that's such an important thing that really distinguishes her.
Absolutely. It's always the challenge with any kind of story like this, be it a harem anime or a visual novel where you have the multiple romantic roots of, at some point you're going to have to like pick the girl the character gets involved with, right?
Yes.
And you're going to have to justify that you have all these other characters that are great that the individual player might prefer because of their own tastes and experiences as a human being, but the character in the game or the story has to be their own person who has this. This is the best I've ever seen it done, like by far, where like you love all the characters in this, and you as a person might be like you've said, your favorite is Kyo. My favorite, honestly, if I like had to pick the girl to date out of the 5 and I were a high schooler, would be Tomoyo. She would wake me up every morning. She'd kick my ass if I got out of line. I probably need that. She's great, right? But watching the show and watching the story unfold, it is so ludicrously clear how much Tomoya and Nagisa are just built for each other in this really beautiful way that you never, when you get to that moment in episode 18 that the director loved so much, where all the other girls realize, it's not that they're realizing like, that bitch stole my man, right? It's not that kind of thing at all. It is this, I think there's a happiness in it too. It's that they love these two people, Tomoya and Nagisa, and it's just become so obvious in that moment to them all that like, but they're made for each other. Like their happiness relies on being together, and that means we will happily sacrifice trying to get in the middle of that because we care about these people. And that's that's a gesture that I don't know if I've seen another show like this make that fulsomely, especially when you're doing the thing where sometimes having the show where every girl falls in love with the main character can feel like very narcissistic and self-serving, of like, this character is has been made to be so perfect. And I don't think that's what they're doing here at all. And part of that is how strong a character Nagisa is. And I think you saying she's a little bit of a Trojan horse is right, because on the surface, you do see how she looks like your standard. If you just look at the cover of Clannad, the video game, I don't think you would think this is an incredible character creation. She looks kind of like the main characters of Kanon and Air and all of that. But it is something on a, I think, completely different level as you get into it. And I can understand how, you had that quote earlier about how Jun Maeda said the people at Key were unsure about how much to focus on her. And I think the reason why they had to is just this character has a life of her own that comes up over the course of the show. And is just an incredible character creation. And again, I think one of the fundamental gestures of Clannad as a TV show that works is that they are effectively co-leads. Tomoya is more our point of view, but they are the two joint main characters, and that's another thing that makes it all flow so fluidly.
Yeah, and the other thing that makes Nagisa a Trojan horse character to me is that like she seems to have that sort of classic Japanese, what's like called the Yamato Nadeshiko is the character archetype of that classic kind of Japanese beauty that's very like gentle and kind and stuff. And usually and fragile, right? And that's part of the thing with Nagisa as well, is that she's this very sickly girl that, you know, she almost died when she was young. She had to take an entire year off of school. You see that she has to take like a couple of weeks off of school when she has another attack. So it's like she has all that stuff, but she has like this really, I think, formidable inner strength. And that's one of the things I really love about her as a character. It reminds me a bit of Nayuki in Kanon, of like you see that kind of gentle and the kindness on the outside, but when push comes to shove, Nagisa is like really willing to go the distance for people. That kindness isn't shallow. Like she's not just sort of like self-serving in that way. She legitimately wants to help people, and she's really emotionally invested in them and their well-being, almost to the extent where it sort of like backfires on her. But I think it you know, it comes from how much she sticks through it with Fuko and how far she goes for Fuko and all that kind of stuff. You can feel this, you know, this sort of stubbornness in her. And there's a moment, I forget exactly the context of when it's said, but there's a moment sometime in Nagisa's route in the last 4 or 5 episodes where she comes home and she's decided she wants to do something a specific way. And Akio, her dad, basically just gives up immediately. Is like, well, I know how stubborn you can be, my daughter. And it's like, it's so true. Like, you wouldn't think of it on the outside. It's because she's so soft-spoken and gentle most of the time. But once her mind is set, she's very stubborn about things, and she's really insistent on seeing them through. And I really love seeing that side of her, like that she's like a full, it's another thing that just makes her really feel like a full person and not just a character to date because you want like this sort of very cute but fairly like submissive character, which is what that character archetype is so about. Here, she's not just submissive. It's like she has things that she cares about. She has priorities, and she's very like strong in how she tries to pursue those things. And that's a part of the characterization that I think really stands out a lot and creates that kind of that gap moe concept, right? There's a difference between what you anticipate about the character and the reality of the character is deeper and more interesting than that. And that's one of the things that makes her really appealing.
There's, I think it's all in episode 23. There's this set of like observations that I think come in because Mei Shinohara, the little sister, comes back. Episode 23 is like the extra episode, although it's very essential on a character level. But it's basically the final of the main season, and comes in and is sort of noticing that the Nagisa and Tomoya are not like being physical or like super intimate as a couple yet, right? And is trying to like play matchmaker. But like because she is an outsider and is also a like precocious child, has a lot of like good observations. And I think part of what comes up in that stretch in that final episode is I like how you see where both characters are seeing things in each other. And one of the things I think Mei asks of like, what do you want from Nagisa as like a person, as a partner? And he says like, he thinks about it, he says, well, I just want her to be more confident. And like, that's like the arc of the whole show, right? Is that like, she is a person with an incredible willpower. This whole community is built around her desire to start a drama club at a school that didn't want to have a drama club, right? Yeah. Like that's a really powerful, she writes her own play at the end and does it. This one woman play, like think about that. If you were think about being in high school, and if there was a girl in your class who did that, you'd be like, that's a very like strong-willed person, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. But she can't see it in herself. Tomoya can see it in her, and his like goal in that relationship is to like create the scenarios by which she can build that confidence and be that person. And that's one of the ways they kind of fill that in together. And Nagisa in turn, I think, recognizes that in him, and that he is someone who also has this kind of pathological need to help. But all of that is just is so interesting and makes the character feel so rich, especially when you get to the end and you see like the length of the journey, which is very everyday, but is also very titanic in its own sense.
Yeah. And then obviously all of this is grounded in Nakahara Mai's performance as a voice actor, which is so strong. Like she's able to, I think, obviously, like, Nagisa is not a character that is funny in the way that Fuko is, that, like, she's not a comedy character, the way that Fuko is, like, partially comic relief, particularly after she disappears and then becomes the Fuko master. But Nagisa is a very funny character in how she bounces off of other people. You have so many really funny scenes, and a lot of this comes from, I think, Nakahara's performance as her. Like, the scene where she meets Kotomi like for the first time or whatever, and they're like introducing themselves to the other person, and they're both so polite, and it's like the conversation just goes absolutely nowhere because of how sort of like very polite and upstanding they are, right? Like Nagisa is polite to a ridiculous extreme. Like this might be something that if you don't know Japanese you wouldn't pick up, but the fact that she calls Tomiya Okazaki-san so insistently throughout like the whole show until episode 23 is really weird. Because Nagisa is she is the same school level as him, right? They're both third year students. So it's like they're on like the sort of social hierarchy. They're on the same level, and you shouldn't use keigo or honorific language with someone on that same level unless they're like you're very unfamiliar with them and you want to be careful about not being too overly familiar. Obviously, that shouldn't be a problem for Nagisa and Tomiya for most of the show. She should have moved to speaking more casually with him the way that he does with her. But then also, Nagisa is actually 1 year older than him, right? That's another dynamic of the show I like that they don't bring a lot of attention to at this point. You get a little bit of it in episode 23, but like she is 1 year older. It's just she was held back for a year. So like from that perspective, if you're taking like their role in the school hierarchy out and you're looking at their role in like just general Japanese society, she would be technically like a little bit higher. So the fact that she uses keigo and she's that polite is unusual. And it's like a character trait of Nagisa. It's one of the ways in which she kind of like pulls herself back and is so reserved. And it's one of those things about her that like that thing of her not having confidence, that lacking of confidence is expressed in the fact that she's very insistent on using honorific language with people that she shouldn't be using it with anymore. And all of that, like a lot of that characterization, this is like Nakata Mai, I think just finds all the little like sort of rich nuances of that way the characters are written, expressing all those different details we've talked about. It's just a really incredible performance. She's not been in a lot of stuff that we've covered before. I think the only thing we've seen that she's been in is she is in Rekengisa in G. She's the character Barada Peor, which is the pink-haired lady that is masks the bad guy, or the Char of that show is like kind of right-hand lady. If you see an image of her, you will remember who she is from that show. That's a very good, very different character. But she is in some other stuff I've seen that I really like. Her biggest role, which is right around the same time, is as the character Reina from Higurashi no Naku Koroni, or Higurashi When They Cry, which is like a mystery horror visual novel that got adapted into an anime where that character is basically like what if Nagisa murdered people with a giant cleaver. So if you want to see that, Higarashi's pretty good.
That's very easy to imagine. She seems like someone who would murder people with a cleaver.
I mean, that's the whole thing with Higarashi's. It's supposed to look very cute and adorable and like, this is just like a fun anime thing on the outside. And then, oh, the cute anime girl with the funny hat is now murdering people with a bloody cleaver. Holy shit. And she's very good in that series. If you want to see her in another show with Nakamura Yuichi as the main character, you can watch Weekly Girls Nozaki-kun or Gekkan Shoujo Nozaki-kun. She plays a character called Kashima Yu. That's a very different character from Nagisa, but that's a fun one. And then the other thing I noticed when I was looking her up, she is in a crap ton of dating sim games from this period. She was in Dear S, she was in Kimi Kiss, she was in Photokano, and Myself, Yourself. All of those are games / shows that I had heard of. I haven't seen any of them. I think I've seen Photokano. But like she was in so many dating sim games, like it's fucking crazy. So that I can see why she's really good, and she has a lot of range as an actress, because a lot of those other characters I was talking about are very different in how they are played. And one really weird detail I saw with her, because I was looking to see if she was in any other KyoAni stuff, she's not in the Lucky Star anime, but she did play one of the main characters of Lucky Star in an old drama CD before the KyoAni anime was made. So that's a very weird piece of trivia, if you want, that I had no idea that existed. But there's a whole separate Lucky Star cast if you go watch this, or listen to this drama CD from 2005.
Yes. We also need to talk about her parents, where we have...
Oh my god, yes.
Yes. The greatest parents, maybe in anime history. Kikuko Inoue as Sanae, obviously because she is, as you have noted here, Sean, the mom in every anime. We've had the conversation before. And then Ryotaro Okiayu as Akio, who has been in a lot of stuff. Yes,
so with Sanae, I've talked about before with Kikuko Inoue, like this is the role I think of when I think of her. And when I found an interview with her, and she mentioned in that interview that when she recorded this role for the game, they told her that they basically wrote the role for her because she had already been in air at this point.
That's awesome.
Because if you have seen Kikunoe in interviews, she's basically just Sanae in real life. Like that's like so the impression she gives off. It's very good. It's such an incredible performance. I mean, we haven't even got my favorite stuff with that character. All my favorite scenes with her are actually in After Story. But she is so good. She's so funny, but she's also so incredibly warm, right? And I think she pulls off the eccentricities of the character in a way that's really impressive to me. And then, of course, you have Akio-san, the dad, Okayu Ryotaro, who we've looked at in, he was recently cast in Kimetsu no Yaiba as the upper first demon. He's only very briefly at the beginning of season 3, but he makes a very big impression, and that's going to be very good. Then
He'll have some big scenes to come.
Yes, yeah, he'll have some really big stuff to come. We've seen him also in some Gundam stuff. He's Treize in Gundam Wing. He's Andrew Waltfeld, the Desert Fox in Gundam Seed, and yes, and he is Lancelot in Fate Zero, although in Fate Zero, obviously, he doesn't make a lot of, like, he doesn't have a lot of lines. It's more just, like, yelling. If you see some of the other Fate spin-off stuff, he gives a more normal performance as Lancelot in some other areas. Then he is also Scar in the original version of Full Metal Alchemist. So I think we talked about that he was he's good in that show, but he was kind of miscast. That's not really his fault. But when I think of him, I always think of the character Byakuya from Bleach, which is just one of the best characters from that show. Obviously a very big role, a very big show. But yeah, he is a great actor. And he like just lends so much weight to Akio-san. And like the both of them, I believe both Okiayu and Inoue, they're both from like basically the same generation of actors. They're about the same age. And they've been in a lot of stuff together. They mentioned in the interview I saw also that she was in some other show. I don't know what it was, but there was another show airing at the same time where they also played a husband and wife. So like, I think you can just feel like a real natural camaraderie between the two of them as like the main adult performers on the show, that like they're the oldest of the cast. Most of the main characters are all voiced by people in their early 20s. So it's like there's like a additional level of like experience that they kind of lend that I think like anchors a lot of those scenes in the Furukawa household together.
Yeah, they rock, and it is one of the neatest tricks Jun Maeda pulls off in the writing of Clannad, that you have this perfect family, but also it's very funny with the bakery where they run a bakery, but Sanae is terrible at baking and makes weird bread that no one likes. And it is this constant relationship dynamic, and Akio is constantly having to run after his wife and assure her that no, people don't hate your bread. See, I'm eating it. And that's very funny. And then the transition into, well, why do these people who are not particularly good at running a bakery run a bakery? And it becomes the emotional wallop of season 1 of Clannad, which is that Nagisa was ill as a child. They made a mistake that is like a very human, understandable mistake that you would not necessarily hit them as people for. It's actually, I think it's like very intensely relatable, but it is this very horrible thing that happened where they were working. They went out and left her alone one night, and she tried to come after them and fainted in the snow and almost died. And so they put their careers on hold. Akio had been an actor, Sanae had been a middle school teacher, and they instead decided to do something where, this is never stated, but it seems to me like the obvious inspiration for doing the bakery is because they can live above the place and always be together, and it is this like very homey kind of like environment they can build, and they became Sanae wanted to become a baker. The joke that Akio then had to learn how to bake because she couldn't do it is great, but they built this life together that way, and they've hid this from Nagisa because they know she's the kind of person who would like take that on herself, and they don't want her to, because obviously they don't blame her for that. They feel very guilty. But Nagisa does learn. And I will say, I held it together through most of Clannad. It is a show that got me like misty-eyed a couple of times, but not any real tears. And then there's the scene where she can't perform at the play, and Akio bursts in from the back of the room. And Ryotaro Okiayu-san, you're the guy who made me cry in Clannad. That fucking broke me when he is like screaming like, you need to understand, you are our dream. As parents, we take on your dreams. Our dream is for you to do what, you want to do. And then, of course, everyone starts. And you have Sanae does it, and then you have Tomoya do it. All of the people in her, like, literal and figurative family. Jesus Christ. And honestly, I think it moved me more than anything in Air or Kanon purely because like it is this so beautiful mix of the happy and the sad, and it is so organic. It doesn't feel like it is trying to beat you into sad submission. It is like the emotional height of what we've watched so far. Oh my fucking god.
Yeah, it's an incredible scene because it's all what I was talking about with like Nagisa's arrogance is just like she can't see how arrogant that is, and like the way she's acting is so unreasonable. But the problem is that Tomiya, because it's all connected to this stuff with parents, Tomiya can't he doesn't know what to say about it, right? Because he hasn't figured that shit out either. I think he instinctively knows that what Nagisa's doing is kind of ridiculous. I think anyone with like a reasonable head like would look at Nagisa's like, what are you talking about? Like, you idiot. Like, it's like that makes the way you're acting makes no sense. But like from her perspective as a teen, like, I totally understand why she's acting the way she's acting, and Tomiya can't figure out how to help her. So, like, Akio-san running in, and he bangs the wall of the theater, and he shouts, and he points at her. I love, he's like, you know, that would be a place where if you wanted to, in the subtitles, you know, if you wanted to justify some cursing, you could put it in there, because he just yells, Timmy! Like it's basically, you know, he sounds like a character in like a Yakuza game or something, because he's just, you know, he's trying to be very direct with her, and saying it's like, you idiot, you moron. You know, if you want to be very mean in your fan subs, you could say it's like, you dumb piece of shit, what are you doing? Because he's just yelling at her. But it's, as you say, it's this like, our dream is for you to realize your dreams, because that's what it means to be a parent. Which is also like, imagine Tomiya hearing that. They don't focus on Tomiya in this moment, but it's something I thought about. It's like, oh, Tomiya, oh, my boy. He
has no idea about that, right? Yeah. Except through Akio and
yes.
Sanae, who have kind of become surrogate parents to him.
Yeah. And then, yeah, and that just like, that moment is so powerful, where he just blows away all that arrogance that Nagisa had, and makes her like kind of see that it's like, this is what we are here for, is for you. And it's like, and again, it's this thing of this, any adult in their life, like becoming an adult is about making trade-offs. And if you gave Sanae and Akio that choice a million times over, do you continue to be an actor and a middle school teacher, but you give up having your daughter? Like, which one of those roads would you pick? A million times out of a million, they would say, please give me my daughter, please. Like, I'll figure something else out. It's like, that's more important. And being an adult is understanding that you make those sacrifices. And that's just what it is. But when you're a teenager, you don't have that experience yet. You can't see it from that perspective. And yeah, so like him trying to like punch that into her head basically verbally, and then Tomiya coming down, and this is like where it really hits me with Tomiya, is the way he says it, of like, where he says, me and Sunahara are doing the same thing. We've entrusted you with our dream of like making it in this school, right? Because both of them have had their ability, both of them wanted to really like kind of make it through athletics, and both of them, for different reasons, can't do that anymore. And so it's like they've entrusted this dream they had of kind of being big shots or whatever, of like having this big achievement in this high school and be a part of this community and leave your mark behind and all that stuff. They've entrusted that dream onto Nagisa also, and that's the part that really hit me, because I think it's so true that is the motivating thing. And I think it's particularly because Sunohara is included in it as well, and it makes you realize like, right, that motherfucker has been with this the whole time, right? Since episode 1, he has been helping in some way. And at a certain point, before you even realize it, he's just another regular member of the crew that's just hanging out in the drama club and helping them out. And he's wearing the black shirt to be like working behind the scenes like everybody else. And it's like, we've all entrusted this to Nagisa, and she has to like follow through with it. And yeah, it's a beautiful scene that's just like an incredible resolution to all those ideas and that fundamental character psychology they've built up throughout the whole show.
Yeah. It is the moment, obviously, that this season is about, is building to that, and it ties so many characters together. And it's the community and the family thing that this show is about too, right? Which is that, you know, it's not necessarily like, it is not that every single person chases their individual dream. It is that people can come together for something bigger. And for all the characters in that scene, Nagisa is the thing they've wanted to invest in. It is her happiness. And it is both on the side of a parent and a future boyfriend and just a friend. And like, that is a beautiful thing. And all these things can coexist at once. And for her parents, You know, maybe as a kid their dream was being an actor, and as an adult, they're obviously Nagisa is the thing that they care about most in the world, and there's no dream they could ever have that is more important than that or more fulfilling than that. And you see that just in how happy they are as a couple with their frankly kind of dumb bakery that they like aren't very good at running, but like they wouldn't have it any other way, and that's what life is about.
Yeah, exactly. Clannad is life. That's
Clannad is life. Clannad is life. Well, we've already gone 2 hours and 40 minutes, so let's hit out some of the other characters, Sean. Should we talk about the Ichinose arc, which would be like the next step of the show after Fuko that we haven't talked about?
Yes. Yeah, so Kotomi's storyline, this is episodes 10 to 14. Just already hit the voice act here just because you got it. It's Noda Mamiko as Kotomi Ichinose, which we have talked about as Asagami Fujino in Kado no Kyokai, and then also very recently in a very, very different character. She's Lady Prospera in Witch from Mercury, which is...
That is, so I did not, let's just say I did not recognize her here for obvious reasons.
You couldn't really get more different characters than Kotomi and Lady Prospera. She's also Fuka in Persona 3. I just like saying this, so I put this credit on my notes. She's Hellgirl in Hellgirl. This is a good show if people haven't seen it. And also, I realized one of her earliest roles, as like a named character, is Katsuyu, who's like a giant slug that Tsunade summons in Naruto. I didn't realize, never made that connection that she's the giant weird slug in Naruto, but she is. And
I like the eclecticism of the characters you've assembled here. Fujino, Lady Prospera, Hellgirl, Fuka, and Katsuyu the giant slug. That's a great rap sheet.
And then apparently there's a Lucky Star video game that she plays a character in. She's not in any other KyoAni stuff. That's the closest thing she gets. But yeah, this is a great performance. Obviously very... like this is like if Asagami Fujino was just like a nice good girl and didn't have like awful things happen to her and she had magic powers that turned people into little lumps of meat. That it's another one of those performances that like I just find Kotomi raucously funny in this show. And obviously a very different way than Fuko. All the stuff in this show, because all this is like the first part of her storyline is about her trying to learn how to make friends. And not with Tomi and not realizing that they used to be friends. This is another thing that's like vaguely similar to Kanon in that way, although it's played very differently. And all that stuff of her just like starting to make friends with all the other girls, like particularly Kyo, and like the manzai comedy routines that Kotomi is trying to do, where all the characters are like coming into the drama room, and she just keeps on going like, Nagisa-chan dewa arimasen ka? Like, oh, well, if it isn't, Nagisa-chan. Oh, well, if it isn't, Kyo-chan. And she's just like, keeps on doing that over and over again and just missing the comic timing over and over. It's so funny. And then I think probably the joke that I think is the funniest, because it just makes no sense, is Kyo is just yelling at her about how like you just can't do manzai comedy, stop trying, like you just can't do it. And she gives this whole huge ridiculous speech about it in Kansai Ben. It's fucking great. And then Kotomi's like, I'll prove it, I'll show you, I'll do an incredible gag I just saw the other day on TV. And she steps into the middle of the room, she puts her arm up and she points at her elbow and just goes Koko Magaru, which just means this bends, and then she just starts laughing to herself.
That is like, so good.
Nobody has any idea what the fuck that joke is, and Kyo and Tonya just look at each other like, what the fuck is even happening? And she's just like in the corner crying, she's laughing so hard. All that shit with Kotomi, it is unbelievably funny in this show.
And I think something you're hitting on here also is like Kotomi's arc is much bigger than I think just these 5 episodes that are about her specific like backstory and trauma, because it is so much about her coming out of her shell, and that like is there before we get into 10 to 14, and I think it's there after that, where once she settles into the group, she's this weird goofball in the corner who like is she gets to let her freak flag fly, I think is what it is. She's a weirdo, and I love it. She's a great weirdo, and she finds her people, and it's wonderful. But I think the Kotomi arc in those 5 episodes in specific is wonderful, and it is such a good follow-up and counterpoint to the Foucault stuff. It mostly doesn't have any of the sort of fantasy surrealist element. There's the hints about the other world her parents found, and there's a lot of talk about the other world, and we see the little robot guy, so I assume that's all coming in After Story, but we will deal with that later. For this story, it is really just a very down-to-earth story about a girl who has encountered loss, and she is learning to open up again. And like the Foucault story, it has very profound sadness in it, but it is primarily happy because it is about overcoming and building a new family and a new circle of friends. And it is about the word that I kept putting down in my notes, because I think it's very true for the show. It is about resiliency, and it's about the resiliency of the human spirit and our adaptability. You know, if obviously, like, you know, Nagisa's parents are not living the life they thought they were going to live, but they found a new life and they're really happy with it. And I think that's what kind of every one of these stories is about, to some extent, is about that kind of adaptation and resiliency. And the Kotomi arc is sort of the center of the season, in the sense that it's the middle, I think, for good reason. And then, of course, where it builds with the final episode 14 with the whole story of the teddy bear and its journey, is the most ludicrously beautiful thing. Oh my God.
Yeah, and I think like the other element here, this kind of connects into that some of the illusionary world stuff, which obviously also comes into, that's like Nagisa's play, where she's like doesn't know where that story comes from, and then like Tomiya feels like he's heard of it, but he can't tell where, and we get these brief flashes of this girl with the robot in the other world. And yes, that stuff will come up and be a little bit clearer in terms of what all that means in After Story. But one of the ways in which this connects is that what her parents are kind of talking about in this one flashback scene, when her dad gives this big speech, is that if it's effectively like sort of like super string theory, if people are familiar with that at all, one of her theme, Kotomi's theme in the show is called TOE, and one of the episodes is called that as well, which is theory of everything. Super string theory is a theory of everything. It is meant to be a theory in physics that tries to merge like sort of maxi physics of like, oh, here's like planets and gravity and the way that all of that works, the kind of like Einsteinian physics, and then quantum physics, because quantum physics on a quantum level behaves in ways that don't really aren't compatible with the way we understand sort of like maxi level objects. And so one of the big mysteries of physics is how do you bridge those two different branches and that two different understandings of the way the world works. And that's what the theory of everything would be. And so some of the super string theory idea is that on a fundamental level, if you break everything down, you can imagine everything as being strings, quote unquote, that are vibrating at different frequencies. And there's all kinds of stuff that goes into like different dimensions, like other spatial dimensions that these strings would exist in. And one part of this, and one of the ideas, is that there's a fundamental interconnectedness, that if you drill down to everything in existence on a very basic fundamental level, and this is kind of a quantum physics idea, things are entangled, or they're like things can affect something in another space, even if they appear to be completely separate, and that there is some sort of fundamental connection. And I think Kotomi's dad's idea is that this spreads to everything. Like the whole world fundamentally is tied together conceptually by these strings. And so I think that is one of the ideas here, is that is what a community is, right? It's like it's this fundamental interconnectedness between all these different people. What happens to one person in the community affects the other person in the community or everyone else in that community. And so that ties like all the stories, like it affects all the stories in that way. And so I think it's very thematically relevant there. But then that's like what that case is with the teddy bear, right? It is this idea of the world and the human community on a global scale. It's connected by this fundamental humanity of understanding like the love of a parent for a child. And so passing this suitcase with this message, please give this to my daughter. And there's like this, that very, very long montage of all these different places that the suitcase has been and all these people passing it along. And people, like, they translate that statement to all these different languages until it finally makes its way to Kotomi. It's just like a very beautiful story about how the world is interconnected and people are connected on a fundamental level that goes beyond the world that you see, that there's something more spiritual underneath it. And that's the way it connects to some of like that kind of magical realism element that you get in these key stories.
Absolutely. But it also, like, I think it works completely outside of the realm of like,
yes,
the allegory or the magic. You know, it's just the whole thing. It's exactly what you were just saying. I mean, I have it in my notes right here. The metaphor of the case and the bear being passed through so many hands who had to take care of it before it got to Kotomi, which is what this whole show is about, of course. And it is this beautiful encapsulation of what the show is. And I think it's, again, the sequencing of the arcs is so good because I think it's very crucial that this idea is fully articulated here in episode 14 before we move on to the second half of the show or the season that is much more about everybody commingling. No one has like one specific arc going on. Everyone's kind of stories are going on at the same time, as we talked about earlier. And I think having that expressed through Kotomi's story is important. I also want to note that Kotomi here has the exact same backstory as the Andrew Garfield Peter Parker in the Amazing Spider-Man movies, and it made me laugh very hard with the parents who had a scientific discovery. They left because they were going to go do something with their scientific discovery. Their plane crashed. I'd left her alone, and I was just waiting for the moment when she went to Oscorp and got her superpowers, because it did make me laugh. This is a much better version of that story, I want to be clear, but it is identical to the Amazing Spider-Man.
Jonathan, I thought you hadn't watched After Story yet. How do you already know exactly what happens to Kotomi?
It would be, I think they could pull it off. This is a great story. It's a talented crew of people, but it would be very funny if it suddenly shifted and she became Spider-Woman in season 2 of Clannad.
Yeah. Before we move on from Kotomi, the one other joke I want to shout out for Kotomi, because this is another one that made me laugh incredibly hard. Because obviously there's the whole thing with her like wanting to play the violin, and she's terrible at the violin. Good. All that shit's so funny. And after one of those times where she plays the violin, Kyo comes storming into the classroom. It's basically, it's like, Kotomi, what the hell are you doing? And she turns to Kyo and goes, "Konnichiwa," like hello. And Kyo's just like, "Don't you say hello to me?" And then Kotomi goes, "Bonjour." It's like, "Chigao," like no. And she goes, "Bonjour." It's so funny. And the way, like, the delicate animation on every movement of the mouth as she just like really enunciates every little piece of bonjour. Yes. It's so funny. Like, I can't emphasize enough how fucking funny I find all Kotomi shit in the show.
I also really love all of the stuff with Okazaki, like working on the garden and everyone coming and helping. Yes. And his walls come down a little bit there because he's trying to take it all on himself. And finally, the other girls are like, "You idiot, let us help with your crazy gardening idea." And I think that's all very good. And then the whole thing where they are trying for her, because it's all building up to her birthday. And for her birthday, first they want to get her the stuffed animal in the crane game. And Fuko messes that up for them a little bit. And then what they decide to do is they want to give her the violin, but it gets broken. And I love, love, love the little moment where Nagisa has drawn the little coupon, redeem for one violin, and it's got all of the big Dongo family on it. And obviously, like, Kotomi is moved by that gesture beyond words, beyond the violin itself could possibly do, and it's a beautiful way to cap that story arc.
Yeah, and then at the very end, they show up. There's been some kind of time jump because they show up for like a birthday party for Kotomi, and they brought the violin, and then she goes, and the last lines of that story arc are so beautiful because they're like, "Oh, when we invited this person and this person and this person and this person, this person, this person," I think the Tomi is like, "Wait, are we going to be okay? Like, I do call so many people, Kyo." And then Kotomi is like, "No, it's fine. Don't worry. I've got a really big backyard." And you just get the shot of the table in the backyard with the garden and the teddy bear on one seat and the violin on the other. And that's just like, what a great note to end that on. It's like everyone goes and celebrates it with Kotomi, and she's got such a spacious house and backyard that everyone can come over to play. It's very sweet.
Well, because part of the backstory is that when they were kids, Tomoya tried to get a bunch of people to come over for her birthday, and he failed because he wasn't popular at school and nobody knew this girl. And it's just so cool that like 10 years later, he succeeds beyond his wildest dreams and has built this entire community around these people. And it's such a cool marker of time and progress as people, and I love it.
Yeah, it's great. It's all the show's really great. Turns out
all the show's really great. Yes, the next the next section, I guess, if we were breaking down the arcs, is sort of the Tomoyo thing. It's sort of the Kyo and Ryo thing. It's also sort of the Tsunohara thing because we get the episode with his sister, and we get the whole basketball thing. So it really is, from this point on, it is about the entire community, with the spine of the show being, again, restoring the drama club all the way through to the end.
Yes, this is where you get a couple of like really notable episodes here. Is I know that you also pointed this one out. Episode 16, this is one of the ones directed by Takemoto Yasuhiro. And this is the episode that has the basketball game where Clannad just turns into fucking like slam dunk or like Kuriko's basketball for an episode. And it's unbelievable. Like
it's unbelievable.
This is one where when I was going back to take screenshots, I realized like, oh, there's no point in trying to take a screenshot of the basketball section because it's all about the movement. So I did find if people want to see some, like there's a really good, pretty long GIF of a section animated by Ishidate Taichi of that basketball section. And it's just like, you just have to see it in movement. You can find it on Sakugaboru, and it's so good. That whole, just like, I mean, the animation itself is just unbelievably good for a fucking TV anime. It's so gorgeous. But it's also the pacing of the sequence and the story and the drama. It just captures that kind of sports anime thing. Perfect. And it's just for one episode that they do this, but it's so good.
And that is what blows my mind, because if you're wondering, why don't, non-sports anime just do more big sports scenes? It's fucking hard. It's really hard to, have a show where you are not regularly drawing basketball and come in for an episode and do a big basketball game, because if you're drawing Slam Dunk or something like that, where it's a basketball show, all of the artists on staff are going to train on how to draw all the movements of a basketball game, right?
Yeah.
That will become like their sort of, raison d'être, and they will learn how to do all of that, right? And so it is very unusual to have a show that has no basketball except for one episode where it's one of the most lushly drawn basketball episodes of all time, right? It's a crazy thing to do. There's a later episode where they're doing some fun baseball hijinks with Nagisa's parents, and you'll notice there, for instance, that they specifically in the storyboarding cut away before they do big swings because they're not making a huge sequence out of it, so you're not going to go through the trouble of learning how to draw baseball stuff, basically, right? Mm-hmm. Although in one of the Tomoyo episodes they do have a big tennis scene that is also similarly impressive.
Yeah. But
the basketball scene is definitely a standout because it's just again, it's a completely different level of animation. It's almost as if they did a big Dragon Ball fight or something, right? It's just a big different skill set that you wouldn't necessarily expect them to invest in for one scene in one episode. But it is really an important scene to do this with because it is the effort of that basketball game that is a big step in them getting the drama club together. Obviously, it means a lot for Tsunohara and for Tomoya to play the game again, for Tomoya especially because this is the thing he had to leave behind, and all of that. It's a big episode for Kyo, all of that stuff coming together, and it is just indeed a stunning, stunning piece of animation.
Yeah, and I played basketball in elementary and middle school, and just a little tiny bit in high school, and it is there's something about the way they animate some of the dribbling behind the back to kind of juke someone out, and particularly the fucking net and the way the net when it's just when the swoosh it's nothing but net, it just goes straight through and the net pops up and it's oh my god. It's so good. It just gives a really visceral in your mind, my gut, that's what basketball looks like. It's in the same way that if you watch Kuriko's Basketball, which is a very good sports anime that is very well animated, it also is so good at picking up those little tiny details of the way the backboard will vibrate a little bit or something when the ball bounces off of it. It's just insanely good. It's just what a fucking episode that is, episode 16 in particular.
It did definitely make me want to go watch a basketball anime because it's oh right, basketball is a super cinematic sport. Basketball is so exciting. It's so it lends itself to animation and film so well. But yeah, there's a reason why there's a lot of anime about basketball, and it is a fun one to have here. And I also I loved the ending of it where Tomoya. They don't break the rule that because he can't, he cannot shoot with his arm because of his shoulder problem, but he still wins the episode because of that. There's that moment where he gets blocked and is falling and does kind of the Hail Mary throw, and it lands anyway. It's just a great sports movie ending.
Yeah, and it shows that you could his skill with basketball, just because he can't shoot doesn't mean that he can't kind of lead the team. And I liked seeing that. You see this other version of him of the way of how much fun he's having and how committed he is. I think you're seeing in an alternate universe, this is what Tomoya would have been at school. If he hadn't have lost this, and he had lost his motivation, and he's trying to get back through a different method with Nagisa. Like, it's cool to see him. And I like you have like that one guy, like the giant basketball dude, who does look like he just walked out of a different anime in a very good way of like, this is like, you know, he's just built very differently than all these other people. And he's clearly like the captain of the basketball team or whatever. And, you know, he's, I think, like trying to look out for Tomiya in his own way because there's a lot of respect there. And he probably like feels really bad that Tomiya lost this. You know, Nobi would understand more about like how awful it would feel to like not be able to do this than someone who's as into basketball as someone like that guy. There's just like, there's a lot of like unspoken, there's something like really unspoken about the relationship between those two people that I really love. That shows how well written and directed that whole sequence is.
Yeah, but this whole stretch of episodes is so good because I think of how many cylinders are firing. You have the Tomoyo wanting to become the student council president, and all of that is going on. You have the basketball stuff to try to convince the music club to help them share the teacher who's going to help them out, and all of that. And so there's just a lot of different sort of irons in the fire that are all coming together with the friend group. And as you say, it's just an extremely dynamic set of episodes with all these very memorable moments in it.
Yeah, and then you get episode 18, which is the one we talked a little bit about earlier, which is Ishihara's favorite episode. This is the one directed by Noriko Tako, and this is the one that like ends with Tomiyo becoming student council president. That's like the last shot is her having won on the board or whatever. This is just an incredible episode. One, it's got one of the funniest sequences in the whole show, which is the whole middle section of the episode where all the girls come over to Tomiya's house. It's the most harem anime thing in all of Clannad, and they've all made him lunch or whatever. And that's all very funny, you know, because it starts with like trying to build the tension of Kyo and Ryo show up, not realizing that Tomiyo is already there making food for Okazaki because he's suspended at this point. But then the best part is then Kotomi shows up, and then when they all sit down, Fuko just appears out of nowhere with her Fuko Sanjo, and she has her whole incredible, like, you know, fucking Sailor Moon animation she has when she shows up, which is great, and she's just made the most horrific fucking starfish-themed desserts you've ever seen in your whole life. And that scene ends with she's holding up this big star, like hollow starfish-shaped cake to her face, looking at Tomoya through it, and she says, "Best choice, Dayo, Okazaki-san, best choice," and then it just cuts to black, and then it fades back up. It's so funny. It's just one of the funniest bits in this whole show is that whole scene.
There's definitely I didn't realize that's all episode 18. The range of that episode is very high because you also have all the sports that Tomoyo is playing, which is hilarious because that's like the way she endears herself to the student body. And then it ends with that moment we've talked about several times of everybody realizing that Tomoya and Nagisa are fucking soulmates and they have no chance here.
Yeah, and I think just one of the things that's so impressive about it to me is that you've had this slow tension building up through the whole show of Kyo and Ryo, who, you know, there's like a very sort of like classic sort of cliche like love triangle dynamic going on here, right? But the whole dynamic is completely unspoken. And I think that's the thing that's so impressive about it to me in the show. They never explain it in dialogue once. Like neither Kyo nor Ryo ever directly expressed that they have feelings about Tomiya to anybody. It's all just gone through like visual implication and implication of dialogue. But you have, obviously, the whole setup is that both Kyo and Ryo already have a big crush on Tomiya. They've had a big crush on him since before the show has started. Kyo being the older, quote-unquote, older sister of the twins, right? She's coded as being, like, the more mature one and the more active one. She decides to support Ryo, her younger sister, in trying to be in a relationship with Tomiya, even though Kyo also has those feelings. Ryo understands that Kyo has those feelings, but because she's so reserved, she doesn't know how to bring it up with her sister. And so, you know, there's all this romantic tension going on there. Tomiya is basically aware of it, at least particularly on the Ryo side. You definitely understand that he knows that those feelings are there, but he doesn't know what to do about it. He's not receptive. He obviously has his feelings for Nagisa. And then eventually it all, you know, comes together of where they see Tomiya and Nagisa just talking, and they realize, oh, this is like, you know, they're, as you said, they're meant to be together. Like the way that they look together is just completely different than at any other point. You see how listless Tomiya has been the whole time Nagisa has been sick. And that just moment of where Ryo apologizes, she just basically says, "Gomen ne, One-san," And then Kyo is just like, what? Why are you saying that? And she has this very like powerful emotional reaction, and she like her eyes start like kind of darting away where she can't quite make eye contact. And then she slowly starts breaking into tears. Yo starts breaking into tears, and then they hug each other. And it is just the way in which that whole dynamic, everything about that relationship between those three characters is just visual implication. It's so clear that you wouldn't think it, but like nobody ever says it. Nobody at any point in the show ever explains or talks about or narrates or anything that what that romantic dynamic is. It's just is so steadily built up. And I think that moment at the end, there's just such a kind of a catharsis of seeing all these people kind of reach this point of understanding, and this sort of weird barrier between Kyo and Yo around this relationship with Tomiya has now kind of broken down between the two of them. They can embrace. It's just such a great, subtle story told between these people.
Absolutely. Couple other thoughts on Kyo and Ryo. One, it is fucked up beyond all imagining that Ryo is not in the theme song. I just have to say, I know it's because it's the 5 people who have the routes named after them in the video game, but Ryo is just as much a character as Kyo, and I think it is a crime that Kyo and Ryo do not each have their name in the theme song. It's bad. Second, I'm looking at your notes, and I did not realize that Kyo Fujibayashi is voiced by an actress named Ryo Hirohashi, but Ryo Hirohashi is not voicing Ryo Fujibayashi. She's voicing Kyo Fujibayashi. I find this very funny.
It's hilarious, and like even more so, I realized when I was doing my research, both the actress Ryo and the character Ryo, it's the same kanji. It's not just that they have the same reading; it's the exact same kanji. And yes, it is hilarious that that the voice actress who plays Kyo is named Ryo, but not the voice actress who plays Ryo is not named Ryo. They should have found a woman named Kyo to play Ryo. I mean, Akemi Kanda is great, but like the comedy value of Kyo playing Ryo and Ryo playing Kyo would have been worth it. Yeah, it's very weird when I realized that it made it like I had such a hard time remembering the name for the longest time because of that, like, as it just broke those names for me. Ryo Hirohashi, who plays Kyo, I've already talked, this is like my favorite character of the show. The vocal performance is amazing. The character, it's my favorite character design in how expressive she is incredible. But Ryo Hirohashi, the voice actress, my favorite role I've heard her in before, I've talked about this before on the podcast, is Yamada, a character in the comedy show Working, where the easiest way to explain Yamada is she's the Fuko of Working. It's the exact same kind of character that Fuko is. It's just a hilarious character. We've talked about her before as Gyanko in Gundam Build Fighters Try, the best character in that show. I also, looking it up, realized that she is Hato in Unicorn Gundam, so that's another little Gundam connection there. And another thing that if you are into Japanese Sonic the Hedgehog stuff, you would know her probably best as, is that she's the Japanese voice of Tails, and has been so, I believe, since Sonic Adventure 1, certainly since Sonic Adventure 2. So she's been Tails for a long goddamn time.
That's interesting. I have my Sonic X set from Discotech with the Japanese voices that I want to watch her at some point just to hear the Japanese Sonic cast. I would not have... Her voice is like so... She's such a bossy, like, you know, strong person in this. I wouldn't have pegged her as Tails, but that's cool. I mean, the performance is so good. I want to hear her in other stuff. And other than Gyanko and Haro, I'm not super familiar with her, but that's awesome. She's great here. The entire running gag of her running down Tomiya in the street early on is fucking great, including down in episode 23 when they almost hold hands and she runs her motorcycle through the two of them. It's great.
Yeah, or there's a running gag in the first few episodes where she keeps on running into the classroom and chucking a dictionary at fucking Tomiya's head that goes like through the open window behind him and then it like curves and sails off and hits a tree. And there's something about like the way that it curves, it just sells the power of that dictionary so much. And she does that a couple of times. And then in the episode, I think it's like episode 4 or 5, I think it's the first one where Botan the pig shows up. And Tsunohara is like, I think, messing with Botan, and then she throws the dictionary at Tsunohara, and it just fucking wrecks him. It's so good. Just this like slow setup of this joke of this dictionary that finally gets its target. But also you have Akemi Kondo as the younger sister of the twins, Ryo. The thing we know her from is she's Nanako in Persona 4. The most adorable character in anything ever. She's also Octopus Girl in Squid Girl, which is not a character that's in Squid Girl very much, but it makes a very big impression. And she's also one of the main characters in Tokimeki Memorial 3, and she's one of the main characters in the Negima series. Which, again, I haven't seen Negima, but I just know it's super popular because I've seen those characters everywhere. But very good vocal performance there as well.
Did we talk about Tomoyo's voice actress yet?
No. Kawashima Hoko, the star of Gundam Seed. Tomio, voiced by Kawashima Hoko. We talked about her a lot in Gundam Seed because this is the actress who plays both Flay, the sort of half girlfriend or whatever. I don't know how you describe that relationship she has with Kira, the woman that Kira sleeps with and has a weird relationship with, and then Natarla, who's the secondhand lieutenant or whatever on the ship. She plays both those characters in Gundam Seed. If you listen to that Weekly Suit Gundam podcast where we talk about how insane it is that they're just fuck it, she's so good, why not just cast one actress as both of these characters? It's so, and they clearly loved her a lot because then she also came back in Gundam Seed Destiny as Stella. So she plays 3 different, quite major characters in the Gundam Seed shows, which is crazy. She's also Tanjiro's mom in Kimetsu no Yaiba. And then she is Rose in the original Full Metal Alchemist. And then I don't remember why I noted all these ones down, but she is in a bunch of fighting games. So she's Sung Mina in Soul Calibur, she's Kasumi Dead or Alive, and she's Android 21 in Dragon Ball FighterZ. So if you really want to play a fighting game and you like Kawashima Hoko, there's at least 3 different big choices you have for you.
I mean, honestly, I think it's a little criminal that none of these fighting games have put Tomoyo in as a guest fighter. I would absolutely, Soul Calibur always has their guest fighters. She would be great for that. She's already in the series. Let's do that. Frankly, Street Fighter, you said she's a lot like Chun-Li. I would absolutely play Tomoyo Sakagami in Street Fighter 6. That'd be great.
Oh my god. I mean, at the very least, they should just put it a Tomoyo skin, just so you can do that level too. Well, you know what? I should go just make my character in Street Fighter 6, the story mode, just look like Tomoyo. That's the thing you could probably pretty easily do. And then put that Chun-Li set on and go to town on find some blonde motherfucker in that game to just kick the shit out of. That's your Clannad video game right there.
Absolutely.
Speaking of Tomio, we might as well talk about there's the Tomio chapter, episode 24, which is the most stunningly animated fucking thing in the world. Like that, it is just straight up movie quality. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's or it's like a classic OVA because it's effectively an OVA, right? It was released as an extra on the last DVD for Clannad, but I feel like once you get kind of out of the 90s and the sort of what an OVA really was, which was a release that it was a series or a mini series that existed purely on home video and not as an extra bonus episode, which is what kind of OVAs are now. Old school OVAs had that reputation of having the really high quality animation. The modern kind of here's a bonus episode that comes with a volume of the manga doesn't always have that same thing. This is that old school, oh hell yeah, this is an OVA. This is some we spent 6 months making 22 episodes of this fucking anime and it looks real damn good.
Yeah, I think, I think as a general rule of thumb, I'm not super interested in the alternate universe stories and this kind of thing. I understand why they do them because it's material from the game they get to adapt, but you're so invested in the rest of the story at that point that it's kind of an afterthought. But this one worked for me almost just by pure dint. The production is so good and passionate that I think it really, it only has 25 minutes to give you this kind of alternate universe, but I think it sells that. It is so beautifully directed. It's so beautifully animated. I think it finds a really strong emotional core in this alternate version of what if you had Tomoya, he never had Nagisa, but he would still have this delinquent streak and this sadness and inadequacy. And is there a version of A Life with Tomoyo where he could overcome that? And they kind of paint that picture for us. And it's more compelling than I think it frankly has any right to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's just and I think honestly it works way better in this form than if you had a 5-episode story arc committed to doing this story.
Yes.
There's something about the sort of very condensed nature of the passage of time. There's a couple of long montages basically that show the passage of time as they've kind of separated. I think it makes this sort of story more engaging because I think it would be kind of excruciating if you had to drag out this long separation between these two characters across multiple episodes. If there's one criticism I have, it's that they should have done just like a 5-minute animation that just shows Tomiya and Tomio being the shit out of that glasses dude from the student council, voiced by Fukuyama Jun, who's just an asshole, is the one who like kind of separates the two of them. That's like the one piece of catharsis I want, is that dude never got any comeuppance for being just an absolute piece of shit. That dude deserves something bad to happen to him. That's the only bad thing I have to say about that Tomio chapter.
I mean, there's a lot of people who deserve some shit happening to them because they are extraordinarily judgmental of poor Tomiya, who is a goddamn abused child who should be cared for. But it is, it is a Japanese character type, and I think what I understand is a social truth about Japan is kind of the way, people are ostracized in this way. But yes, it is very good. It is, again, as I said, I think it was more compelling than I thought it would be, partially because, as you say, it looks like an old school 90s OVA, partially because it is just done with a lot of passion, and I'm glad it exists.
Yeah, and again, we will get one like this for the Kyoto storyline in After Story. I would actually maybe recommend people maybe watch that before After Story or something.
My brother has been telling me that. He's seen Clannad before, and he was telling me, like, hey, I just found it real whiplashy to go from the end of After Story to the OVA. Just watch it first, because it's in the same timeline as this Tomio
Exactly.
thing.
Yeah, because there won't be any spoilers in it, because it's an alternate ending for the school section. And by the time you get to the end of After Story, I mean, so much time has passed. You're talking about another 22 episodes of anime from this point. So that might be something worth doing if people want to watch that Kyoto one. Maybe do that before After Story, or you will be, or you have to give yourself like a wide berth after watching After Story, so you can kind of reset yourself a little bit. But yeah, other than that, let's see. The other big character that I want to make sure we give a little bit more time to is Tsunohara, because we've talked about him a little bit, around him a little bit, but he is, like every other character in this show, I think he's like so much better than this type of character usually is in these sorts of shows. Tsunohara is voiced by Sakaguchi Daisuke, who we know well as one of our Gundam boys, Uso, in Victory Gundam. His most well-known role easily is Shinpachi in Gintama, which is a little bit, I guess, kind of more similar to Tsunohara in the sense that it's a much more comic role. He's also Mishima, the Moon Arcana guy in Persona 5, who's like the dude who is bullied in the school. And then he, as I said before, he is also a very similar kind of character in Hyoka. Also, it's not going to be Yuichi in the main role, so we'll get some really good back and forth between those actors in that show as well. And then also, I didn't realize this, I think, at the time, but he is in that one little bit in Air on the TV where there's like that G Gundam reference. He is the fake Domon in that TV show. So I thought that was funny. But yeah, that's
a very different Gundam character than the one he got to play. I'll say that.
a very different Gundam hero than Uso, that is for sure. But yeah, Sakaguchi Daisuke here, it's such a good comic performance that has like so much more under it. There's something about Tsunohara where he is like secretly, I think, the most emotionally well-adjusted character on the whole show. And there's something about that I love. Like the way in which he very quietly supports Tomiya throughout the whole show, gives Tomiya a place to come back to, gives him advice, particularly in the last few episodes where he's there like to help him be with Nagisa, and he sees how like important this is for Tomiya. There's just like this like kind of quiet, confident relationship he has where I think you see that he is actually more mature than these other characters. I think like some of his experience probably having been on that soccer team and the fact that he has like a supportive home life and stuff, but he's also been able to go a little bit off on his own, so he hasn't been pampered kind of the way that Nagisa has. It just gives him this feeling where it's like, Tsunohara, you're a good fucking dude. And it's like, you got a good head on your shoulders, even if you can get up to some punk stuff every once in a while. He's the secret glue that ties everything together.
The scene that really brought his character together for me is in that final stretch where the Nagisa's family is planning a picnic, and they clearly want to include Tomoya because they just see him as part of the family at this point, and they would do it for anyone who is staying with them, obviously. But Tomoya feels very self-conscious about this, so he runs out and he goes and is like hiding out at Tsunohara's place, and Tsunohara knows he can't just directly say, you're being a selfish shithead, go back and be with your, found family. So he kind of has to talk around it and kind of be like, if I were with Nagisa, I would do this, and he kind of does it in his own sort of Tsunohara way, but Sakaguchi really, I think, modulates the performance so you hear the seriousness in his voice, and it convinces, and it cuts through to Tomoyo what kind of an asshole he's being in his own self-consciousness, and gets him to go back and have this great day together where they're playing baseball and all this stuff. And I fucking love that scene. And it speaks to how good the show is. You can take a character who is that silly and turn eventually to a moment like that. And as you say, come to realize he's actually pretty well adjusted. He's a fucking goofball, but that is more like kind of hiding underneath, he's someone who I think has a good head on his shoulders.
Yeah, because he's also in that kind of middle stretch of the show where all like the basketball game and stuff happens. There's the way in which he gets like very upset about Nagisa not standing up for herself, and he's like pushing honestly harder than any other character for the drama clubs thing, because he, like, I think, realizes that, again, like, people have to make sacrifices, and it's like, it's okay for you to fight for your drama club, even if that means that this other club might not be able to happen. You have as much a right for your club as they do, and if you want it to happen, you need to fight for it. And it's like, you can't, like, it's like not everything's always going to be perfect. And obviously they do find like a nice solution to that problem once they get the student council president thing resolved. But there is a truth to what Tsunohara is fighting for. That's like, you can't just back down from this, or you're letting everything go to waste. And there's just that way that he just has like this more adult perspective on things that makes him a very interesting character, because he's also the guy who, like, Tomio kicks the shit out of and then kicks him up into the air, and then Tomio opens up the fucking like a garbage chute or whatever, and Tsunohara falls in the garbage chute and gets ejected out of the school. He can be both those things, and it's great.
Absolutely. And I do just have to say, since we're the Weekly Suit Gundam people, it will never not be funny to me that Daisuke Sakaguchi is kind of predominantly known for comedic roles, and his like first starring role was Uso Ewen. There's just something about that like his breakthrough in the industry was the role where he holds a severed head in a fucking helmet and goes, "This was my mother," and then he is Shinbachi on Gintama, and he's Tsunohara here. It's great.
Yeah, it is very funny. One other thing, this is like a very minor note, but something that when I was looking up the cast just jumped out at me, because it's like, we've talked about both these actors before. So this is Hayami Saudi's second credited actor role ever in anime, is as female student in episode 1 of Clannad, which Hayami Saudi is, of course, we've talked about her a lot of stuff, like she's the butterfly lady in Kimetsu no Yaiba, whose name I'm blanking on now, but she's in everything. She's Yor Forger in Spy Family, and she's Ayaka in Genshin Impact, and she is female student in episode 1 of Clannad. I have no idea where her voice popped up. I didn't notice it. It was just going through the cast list. I was like, oh, female student. That's crazy. Then I looked and I was like, oh, this is the second thing she was ever in. And then also Okamoto Nobuhiko, who people would know as Bakugo in My Hero Academia, or he is Genya in the 3rd season of Kimetsu no Yaiba. He is male student in episode 2, and that is his 9th credited role ever in anime. So they
had good instincts. A lot of good characters. Hayami Saori also, of course, Yamato on One Piece. That's one of her big roles right now. And I'm noticing that Okazaki's dad is Garp on One Piece. That's interesting. I didn't hear the voice enough to make that connection, because Okazaki's dad doesn't talk a lot in this show, but that was interesting to me.
Yes, and he's Okazaki's dad, the actor Nakahiroshi. He is also Gamabunta, who is a giant toad man in Naruto, and that you would never know. I'm going to guess that probably Gamabunta sounds like Monkey D. Garp, because I saw the character design. I've never seen that character in One Piece, but he looks like a dude who probably would sound like a giant toad man.
Garp is Luffy's adoptive father, essentially. Is Gamabunta someone's father in Naruto? Because I'm seeing a father theme here.
Yes.
Okay.
He is. He's a father of a smaller toad man.
Okay.
Who is like Naruto's buddy.
Garp's a great character. He's one of the admirals. It's the irony in One Piece is that Luffy's dad is an admiral and Luffy's a pirate, and what will they do? Anyway.
Well, Bunta has
I think
a
of
giant
Garp as a big
Yakuza
character,
sword.
but One Piece has over 1,000 fucking episodes, and I don't think he's in that many of them. So that's a very infrequent role, actually. But Garp is still a major character. What qualifies as a major character in One Piece is just kind of crazy because of its length.
Yeah. But,
Anyway.
Point being, lots of really good voice actors. And we'll get this character more in After Story, but I'll just mention, just because she's in everything else we've covered so far this season, Tamara Yukari is Mei, the younger sister, in this as well. She's Michiru in Air, another younger sister, and she's Mai in Kanon, not a younger sister in that one. But, Tamara Yukari.
She's great. That character's only in like 2 episodes, but she's one of my favorites here.
Yes.
And I'm excited to see more of her. Absolutely. But yeah, one thing before we go on this episode, almost missed it. We got to talk about the music here, Sean.
Yes.
Do you want to give us some of the notes?
Yeah, so the music, again, this is, KyoAni is very savvy, and they're like, this is the third one, and we still don't have to pay any money for our music, because we have so many albums to choose from here. So all the music in this is pulled from either the game or the different albums they made around the game using that music. The opening theme is the opening theme from the game. Though from what I understand, I think the opening theme from the game actually plays, like, you have to get really far into the game or something when it actually plays. But it's called Megumedu, or Megmel. Or specifically, this version is Megmel Kukul Mix 2007. This is by the band Euphonious. Specifically, this song is both performed and composed by Euphonious. So this is the only one of these vocal songs. This will be true also, like none of the songs in After Story like this. The only one that is not composed by one of Key's in-house composers. And I'll say, like, I do think I can notice, like, this is the one opening theme. I don't think it's bad. I'm not necessarily in love with this one. And I know the theme already, obviously, from After Story, and I substantially prefer that one. Like, this is fine, but, like, I think you can tell that it's not any of the major composers from Key. It is the name of the song does also come from Celtic mythology. It is basically Magmel is the Celtic version of heaven, so that is where they pulled the name. Also, that kind of like Clannad connection.
Yeah. I like the song. I do think the mix for the anime is much better. If you've heard the song from the actual visual novel, it's pretty different. It would not work as an anime theme song, so there's a reason why they did this new mix of it. But fuck that. We need to talk about the end theme. It's the greatest.
Yes. The ending theme, so this is... If I made a top 10 greatest anime ending themes ever, this would maybe be my number one for like some reasons that will be even probably more clear in After Story. But Dango Daikazoku, which is performed by Chata, the song is composed by Maeda Jun. Obviously also like the melody comes from the Nagisa theme. This is just like, what a fucking ending theme. Both in terms of the theme itself, the animation, which is incredible, the kind of papercraft look it has is so good, but the way in which the Dango Daikazoku is like thematically and literally integrated into the show as this thing that Nagisa loves. She adorably sings the song a couple of times in the show, and even though you didn't see it, they do tell you that she just at the end of her play just started singing the Dango Daikazoku thing, which is fucking hilarious. And I just, the Dango Daikazoku, it's a song that like I have a hard time listening to without kind of tearing up a little bit. And again, some of that reaction is some other association from stuff in After Story, but even just this show, fucking Dango Daikazoku, it's so good.
It's unreal. It's amazing. I like it more every time I hear it. As good as Clannad is, I think it ultimately is a delivery system for watching the Dango Daikazoku song. I would agree it would be in my top 10 anime endings. It's so phenomenal. And as you say, it has all these thematic connections to this show, to I think the whole kind of thesis statement of the series. It is also adorable. I think I was listening yesterday to the full like 5-minute version of the song and then the TV edit. I actually like the TV edit more because in the 90-second version, the like big verse that ends the shorter version is done without all the kind of music underneath it. It's still in the sort of quieter version. And then when the big like orchestra swells underneath in the full version, it's just humming over top that. And they recut it so that the verse is over the big orchestral part for the TV edit. And I think it's really powerful. I really love the build of it in the 90-second version. And yeah, it is just... I skipped the theme song sometimes. I did not ever skip the end theme. Every single time I had to watch the Dango Daikazoku and sing along, and it is beautiful. Yeah,
it's so good. And again, I just have to shout out that like the whole aesthetic of the animation is so gorgeous. It just, I love how different it looks from everything else in the show.
I also after, because in episode 1, I watched and I'm like, that's a weird end theme because they had not introduced the Dango Daikazoku in the show yet. I have to wonder if there was like a conversation of, is there any way to get the introduction of the Dango into episode 1 so people aren't confused by the end theme? But no, it comes fast enough. It's in episode 2 is when you learn about it. I'm like, that's why that's the end theme. But when I learned that, I immediately went to Google and went, is that a real thing or did Clannad make it up? Because that sounds like it would be a real Japanese advertising campaign. And I am not the only one who thought that, because there was a whole Reddit thread of like, is that real? And people going, no, they made it up for the game. It's just really good.
Yes, because you're right. It does sort of like, it so feels real. Like it definitely feels like it could just be like a Japanese reference that you wouldn't get. And it's, I mean, obviously once you know that the song was composed by Maeda Jun, I think that becomes clear. But yeah, in the show itself, so good. Yeah. So Dango Daikazoku, like that is not the ending theme of After Story, but that song will not leave us. It is diegetically a piece of the show. So we will continue to hear Dango Daikazoku in other contexts further on. There's also a whole host of different insert songs all pulled from the game as well. So you have Anna, which is sung by Leah in episode 9. This is plays at the ending of the Tomio chapter episode. You have Kage Futatsu, which is, I believe that's the ending theme for the for the game in the normal route or whatever. And that is plays as an insert song in episode 22. I believe that's also the title of episode 21, if I remember. Kaze no Shoujo.
No, that is the title of episode 22.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
So Two Shadows is what that means, Kage Futatsu. Kaze no Shoujo, or A Girl with Wind, also sung by Dia, is its insert song in episode 9. That plays in the wedding scene. They have the song Over in episode 18. I believe that's during the big sports montage, also voiced by Dia. So all those, again, are pulled from the game and associated soundtracks. All those are very good insert songs. And then I have to also shout out specifically some of the songs from the soundtrack, because this is the one where I've obviously been listening to the soundtrack for a long time because it's so good, and I watched the show 10 years ago. But this soundtrack is just incredible. It's got a bunch of really great themes, particularly all of Maeda Jun's songs on the soundtrack are just killer. He's got the Nagisa theme. He's got the song Onaji Takamie, or To the Same Heights, and the song Negai ga Kanao Basho, or The Place Where Wishes Come True, all of them being basically kind of sad piano songs, because that's Maeda Jun's whole shtick. That's his fetish, is sad piano songs, but they're very different. And, they're not just sad. That's, kind of dismissing them a little bit. There's a more complex range of emotions there, but all of them are these very emotional piano pieces, and all of them are so good. And whenever any of those songs come up in the anime, it really hits me very hard, because I have a lot of emotional relationship to all the songs. And then obviously all the songs in the soundtrack are great. I also particularly want to shout out Fuko's theme called Hurry Starfish. This is one composed by Togoshi Magome. That theme is incredible. And on one of the remix albums, there's a remix of that with a Vocaloid doing the main theme, but just as Papi Pupe Po noises. And it is the fucking best shit in the world. If people have not heard the Papi Pupe Po version of Hurry Starfish, you haven't fucking lived yet.
That's amazing. Yeah, so that's Clannad Season 1, Sean. Does anything sad happen in After Story? I don't know if I want to watch it.
Oh no, it's all happy. Kotami becomes a superhero. She becomes Spider-Man, as we already talked about. She saves everybody. She rescues the robot and the little girl from the illusionary world. Everyone comes here. All the characters who died or had tragic things that happened to them in the other shows, they come back and all they're just happy and nothing sad ever happened. Misuzu's here and she's Nagisa's best friend. That's just what After Story is. It is great and happy and nothing bad ever happens to anyone ever again.
All right. Well, we will watch that next week. It'll be the end of part 1 of season 4. Crying is the Key to Happiness, and we'll move on after that. I am very excited to see where this goes.
Yes, there's definitely no reason why the word crying is in the title of this part 1, and Clannad is the only one of these shows I had already seen. There's definitely no reason I put that there. Everything is just happy. And I'm not stressed about it at all.